There is a long tradition of thinking about this particular hour. The Stoics called it the hour of the wolf, the time when the mind, stripped of the day's distractions and not yet softened into sleep, sees what is actually there. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his journal by lamplight. Pascal sat in a cold room and listened to what the silence was telling him. Kierkegaard walked the streets of Copenhagen because the alternative was lying still in a room that felt too small for the thoughts that would not slow down. The fact that you are awake at this hour is not a malfunction. It is, in its way, a form of honesty. The hour after midnight does not allow performance. It removes the audience and leaves only what is actually true. The question it asks tends to be the one that most needs asking. Viktor Frankl understood this intimately. He had spent more than 2 years in conditions where the question could not be avoided even in daylight, where the stripping away that most people only experience at night was the permanent condition of the waking hours. What he found in that extremity was that the question itself was not the enemy. The question was the way through. We will sit with it tonight. Not rush it, not answer it, before it is ready to be answered. Just sit with it, the way Frankl sat with it, the way the best minds of every century have sat with it when the hour was honest enough to demand it. Let the room be still. Let the breath come on its own. It is sometime after midnight, or close to it. The house has gone quiet. The sounds of the day, the conversations, the small decisions, the tasks that filled the hours without quite emptying them, have settled into something softer. And yet, your mind has not settled with them. There is a particular kind of thought that visits at this hour. It is not worry, exactly, though it arrives in worry's shape. It is not grief, though it carries grief's weight. It is more like a question that has been patient all day, waiting for the noise to clear so it can finally be heard. The question sounds different for different people. For some it is this all there is? For others, did I do enough? For others still, quieter and harder to name, what was it actually for? Viktor Frankl spent his life with that question. Not the comfortable version, the philosopher's version, argued in journals from a safe distance. The version that arrives at 3 a.m. in a place where there is no certainty you will see the morning. He was a psychiatrist in Vienna, and then a prisoner in 4 concentration camps, including Auschwitz and Dachau. And in the space between those 2 lives, he arrived at something. Not comfort in the easy sense, something older and harder than comfort. He called it logotherapy, from the Greek word logos, which means meaning. His belief, forged in conditions that might have extinguished any belief at all, was this: the human being can endure almost anything if they can find the why beneath it. Not an explanation, not a justification, a why. Tonight we sit with Frankl's question, and with the thinkers who circled it before him and after him. Kierkegaard, who mapped anxiety before Frankl was born, Nietzsche, who gave Frankl the words he needed at the worst moment of his life. Camus, who asked the honest question and refused the dishonest answer. Tolstoy, whose Ivan Ilyich died the death that woke Frankl's generation up. Yalom, who spent a career sitting with dying patients and learned what they finally said. We will take our time. There are 4 hours ahead and no hurry. Let your shoulders drop. The room around you is still. Whatever occupied you today can wait. Nothing you hear tonight asks anything of you except to listen. There is a thought Frankl returned to in the worst days of his life, a thought we will come to before this is over. It is not the thought you might expect. It will take some time to earn it. Let that settle. We begin. Chapter 2. The Man Who Studied the Question. Vienna in those years was a city in the middle of something it did not yet know was ending. The coffee houses where ideas were argued were full. The cafes on the Ringstrasse had patrons who read newspapers in 7 languages. The university was producing, simultaneously, some of the most important work in physics, economics, and psychology that the century would see. Frankl moved through this world with a particular alertness. He was interested not in the theories themselves, but in what they left out. Freud's account of the mind was brilliant and partial. Adler's correction of Freud was clarifying and also partial. What both were missing, Frankl kept noticing, was the dimension of the future. Both Freud and Adler explained the present from the past, from the early wound, from the repressed desire, from the formative power of what had already happened. Frankl kept watching his patients being pulled forward by something, not pushed from behind by history, drawn ahead towards something they were reaching for. He was reaching for the name of that thing. He had not found it yet. He was still in the early stages of a clinical career that would turn out to have the strangest and most clarifying interruption in the history of modern psychiatry. Let the breath move. We are building toward what the interruption taught him. In Vienna, in the years between the 2 great wars, a young psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl was asking a question his colleagues found uncomfortable. Not the usual questions of his field. Not what drives the mind toward pleasure, as Freud had taught. Not what drives it toward power, as Alfred Adler had proposed. Something quieter and more fundamental. What drives the mind toward meaning? What is it that the human being is actually looking for when everything else has been stripped away? Frankl was born in 1905. He grew up in a Vienna that was, for a brief window, one of the intellectual capitals of the world. Freud held his famous Wednesday night meetings not far from where the Frankl family lived. Adler ran a clinic nearby. The cafes of the First District buzzed with arguments about the nature of consciousness, the origin of neurosis, the structure of the self. Frankl absorbed all of it. He corresponded with Freud as a teenager, an actual letter answered by the founder himself, a detail Frankl remembered for the rest of his life. He studied under Adler and was eventually expelled from Adler's circle for disagreeing with the master. He began developing his own approach. He noticed something in his patients that neither Freud nor Adler quite named, a kind of emptiness that was not depression in the clinical sense, not neurosis in the old sense, something more like a hollowness, a sense that the activity of living was not quite adding up to anything. The patients who came to him were not always suffering in the way suffering was supposed to look. Sometimes they were doing well by every measurable standard, and they were still awake at night asking a question they could not name. He called it the existential vacuum, the felt absence of meaning. He is worth knowing before we go any further. So let us take a moment with the man himself. He was slight in build, quietly spoken, with wire-framed glasses, and a manner that patience described as unhurried. He was not a man who performed warmth. He simply seemed to have it. In session, he was known for long silences that did not feel empty. He had a habit of waiting until the patient said the true thing rather than the prepared thing. He never lost that habit, even after everything. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. Let your jaw soften. Nothing you hear tonight asks anything of you. Let that be true. We continue. Chapter 3. 2 Kinds of Emptiness. The philosopher Simone Weil, writing in France in the 1940s, the same years Frankl was in the camps, made a related observation from a very different direction. She wrote about the experience of waiting without an object. Not waiting for something specific, waiting as a condition of the soul, a state of open attention that does not fill itself with its own contents, but remains available to whatever might arrive. She thought this kind of waiting was close to prayer, though she used that word carefully and not in any institutional sense. It was the opposite of the restless emptiness Frankl was naming. It was the emptiness that has stopped arguing with itself. Frankl would have recognized the distinction. He saw both kinds in his patients. The existential vacuum, the second kind of emptiness he named, was not the stillness Weil was describing. It was the emptiness that had not yet found its direction. The emptiness that was still mistaking itself for failure rather than reading itself as a question. The question, when finally heard clearly, is always, what is genuinely mine to do? Not what should I be doing in the eyes of the world I grew up in? What is actually, specifically, mine? That question does not fill the emptiness. It transforms it into something workable. Let the breath move. The room is still. There is more than one way to feel empty. The first kind is familiar. It arrives after loss, after something ends, a relationship, a role, a version of yourself you had grown attached to. It has a name and a shape. It is grief or disappointment or the ache of a specific absence. It hurts, but it makes sense. You know what you are missing because you had it. The second kind is stranger. It arrives without a clear cause. It can arrive in the middle of success, in the middle of a life that looks complete from the outside. You have the job, or you finish the project, or your children grew into people you are proud of, and you reach for the satisfaction that should be there, and it is not quite where it was supposed to be. This is the emptiness Frankl was watching in his clinic in the 1930s and 1940s. He gave it a careful name. He called it the existential vacuum, an inner void that is not the result of something going wrong, but of something never having been named or filled in the first place. He observed that it tended to appear on Sundays, on the days when the structure dropped away and the person was left alone with themselves. He named this phenomenon the Sunday neurosis, the depression that crept in when the week's momentum stopped, revealing what it had been covering. Here is the thing about the second kind of emptiness. It does not respond to the treatments for the first. You cannot grieve your way out of it because there is no specific loss to grieve. You cannot distract your way out of it because distraction only delays the moment when it becomes audible again. And you cannot achieve your way out of it because achievement does not touch it. As the person who woke up the morning after their greatest success and felt nothing can attest. Hold that gently. It comes back later. There is a name for what lives at the bottom of the second kind of emptiness, and Frankl found it in a place that would have extinguished a lesser mind. For now, let your breath move on its own. You do not need to change it. The second kind of emptiness is what tonight is about, and it has an answer. We are working our way toward it. Let the room be still. Chapter 4, Vienna, 1930. The clinic was not glamorous. It operated in borrowed spaces, staffed by volunteers, funded by nothing except the conviction that the work mattered. Frankl kept records in a notebook. He shared cases with colleagues who came in the evenings and argued about approaches. He was young, and he was certain about very little, and he was doing the work anyway. There is a quality of that period in his writing that is hard to name, but that comes through clearly. It is the quality of a person who has found early the specific thing that is waiting for them. Not because the thing is comfortable, the work was demanding and uncertain and unrewarded in any ordinary professional sense, but because the fit between the question and the person asking it was genuine. He was asking, in those rooms, something that the people who came to him were also asking in their different ways. What keeps the morning worth starting? He was not pretending to have the answer. He was conducting the investigation honestly, with whatever tools were available, in the belief that the investigation itself was worthwhile. The people who came to him trusted that belief. Something in the quality of the attention in that room, unhurried, non-judgmental, genuinely curious, told them they had arrived somewhere that was taking their questions seriously. That quality of attention is what Frankl eventually named after the war as one of the primary therapeutic instruments. The therapist who is genuinely present to the patient's search is already, in some measure, helping. Feel the weight of the body where it rests. We go on. In the autumn of 1930, Viktor Frankl opened a clinic for young people who were in crisis. Not the wealthy, not the well-connected. The young people who came to his door were often students, workers, teenagers, caught in the social upheaval of a Vienna that was beginning to feel the pressure of forces larger than itself. Many of them were suicidal. Some had already made attempts. They arrived because there was nowhere else to go. Frankl worked with them without charging fees. He organized colleagues to staff the clinic in shifts. He gathered the data, tracked the outcomes, refined the approach. In the first year, not one of the young people who came through that clinic died by suicide. He kept that record for years. What he was learning in those rooms shaped everything that came after. The young people who came to him were not suffering primarily from chemical imbalance or repressed desire. They were suffering from something Frankl began to articulate with increasing precision. They could not find a reason to go on, not a dramatic reason, not a philosophical argument, a felt reason. Something in the texture of daily life that made the morning worth starting. He began to see that the psychiatric frameworks of his time were not quite adequate to this. Freud had identified the unconscious, Adler had mapped the will to power. But neither had quite named this particular form of distress, the distress of the person who has no specific wound, but also no specific anchor. Frankl was building one. He was not there yet. He would not be there until much later, and the path to it would run through places no one would choose. But in 1930, in that clinic, in a Vienna that still had coffee houses and concerts and a working tram line, he was asking the right question. He was asking what it is that people actually live for. Not what they say they live for. What actually keeps the morning worth starting. The question would outlast everything else about that city, and Frankl would survive to answer it. Chapter 5, the manuscript he thought would burn. He was permitted to bring one small bag when they came for him. He chose carefully. The manuscript went into the lining of the coat. He brought nothing that could not be walked away from if the coat remained. The coat did not remain. What is remarkable about the loss of the manuscript is not the loss itself, though that was real, and he felt it. What is remarkable is what he did next. He did not decide that the work was destroyed. He decided that the work lived in him, had always lived in him, and could be reconstructed from what he knew. He began the reconstruction. This is a small detail, and it is everything. The person who receives a catastrophic loss and concludes that the loss is final, that what has been destroyed cannot be rebuilt or continued in a different form, has misunderstood the structure of the first path. The first path is not the artifact. The first path is the creation. And the creation lives in the person who is creating, not in the object that has been produced. Frankl lost the manuscript and continued being the person who wrote it. The second version, when it finally appeared, was not an inferior reconstruction. It was the same argument, clarified by everything that had happened between the first draft and the second. The camps had added a dimension of evidence that no philosopher writing in a comfortable room could have provided. The lamp was still on. He went on writing. Before the camps, Viktor Frankl had been writing. He had been working on a book for years. A careful, systematic treatment of the ideas he had been developing in his clinic and his lectures. The will to meaning, the existential vacuum, the three paths by which a human being can find something to live for. He had been refining the manuscript through the 1930s, adding to it, arguing with it in the margins. In 1942, the Gestapo came. He was deported to the ghetto at Theresienstadt. He was permitted one small bag. He had sewn the pages of the manuscript into the lining of his coat. He survived Theresienstadt. He was transferred. The coat was taken. He was issued a different one, thin, inadequate for winter, taken from someone who had not survived the transaction. The manuscript was gone. The years of work, the precise language he had labored over, the argument he had been building, destroyed. What he did in the months that followed was not to grieve the book. He began to reconstruct it, on stolen scraps of paper, in the margins of forms, in his memory, which was all he had left of it. He would not be able to write it down properly until after the war. But he would not let it go. Here is the thing about that manuscript. Its eventual title was Man's Search for Meaning. It would go on to sell 10 million copies. It would be ranked by the Library of Congress among the 10 most influential books ever written in America. It would be read by grieving people, by dying people, by people in the middle of crises they could not name, by people lying awake at midnight in comfortable rooms trying to find the thread. We will return to what was in it in detail. But hold this image for now. A man in Auschwitz, in winter, reconstructing from memory an argument for the value of being alive. Let your shoulders drop. We are going slowly. That is the point. Chapter 6, What Nietzsche Gave Him. Frankl was not a Nietzschean in any simple sense. He disagreed with Nietzsche on important questions. He thought Nietzsche's contempt for weakness was wrong. He thought the will to power was a secondary drive rather than a primary one. He did not share Nietzsche's hostility to Christianity, which Frankl regarded with respect even from his own Jewish position. But he took from Nietzsche the sentence, and the sentence was enough. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. He quoted it to fellow prisoners in the camps. He quoted it in his lectures for the remaining 52 years of his life. He quoted it because it compressed into 17 words what it had taken him decades of clinical work to demonstrate by other means. The why is not a philosophical argument. It is a felt thing. It is specific. It is personal. It is the face of the person you are trying to return to, or the task that only you can complete, or the question you are the only one positioned to answer. It is not a generalization. It is always particular. Nietzsche arrived at this insight through suffering of his own, illness that plagued him from early adulthood, isolation that he transformed through writing, relationships that failed repeatedly, a mind that ran faster than any container the century had available for it. He was drawing on his own experience of the how, and he was reaching from that experience toward the why that had held him. He did not survive well, but he left the sentence, and the sentence held Frankl. Friedrich Nietzsche died in 1900. Viktor Frankl was not yet born. And yet Nietzsche gave Frankl the sentence that kept him alive. It is a simple sentence. Nietzsche wrote it in Twilight of the Idols, a work from 1889, in the last productive year of his life. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Frankl quoted it in the camps. He quoted it to his fellow prisoners. He quoted it to himself in the small hours of the nights he thought might be his last. He built an entire system of psychotherapy around it. Not because he was naive about the camps. Frankl was not naive about anything. He knew what they were. He saw what they did to the people around him. He understood that the survival rate was not a function of intention or character. Many people with every reason to live did not survive. He understood that. But he also observed something that the statistics could not quite capture. The people who could locate a reason, a specific, particular, personal reason, not a general philosophical argument, but a felt reason, a person they needed to return to, a task they needed to complete, a question they needed to answer, those people seemed to carry something. Not immunity, not certainty, something more like traction, a way of gripping the floor when everything else had been taken away. Nietzsche had written about suffering as a teacher, about Amor Fati, the love of fate, the willingness to say yes to one's life as it has actually been, rather than the life one imagined. He had written about endurance not as passive acceptance, but as a form of strength. Frankl absorbed all of it, and then he was tested on it in conditions Nietzsche could not have imagined. What did he find when theory met the worst thing? We are working toward that. There are things that need to be understood first. Let the breath move. Let the room be quiet. A name every 90 seconds or so is how this works. Frankl, Nietzsche, the two of them across a generation and a catastrophe, passing a sentence back and forth. Hold it gently. Chapter 7, The Arrival. The selection process at the arrival platform has been documented by many survivors, and what strikes almost all of them in retrospect is the same thing: the speed of it. The decisions that determined who would live and who would die that day were made in seconds. A gesture, left, right, and then the person was in a line, moving. Frankl later wrote that the decision of how to respond to this, how to carry oneself in the moments after the selection, in the hours and days of initial disorientation, was not made consciously. It was made by whatever the person had been in the life before the arrival. The person who had, through years of practice or circumstance or character, developed a certain quality of inner resilience, a capacity to locate themselves in relation to what was happening rather than being entirely subsumed by it, found that quality available even here. Not as a guarantee, not as a formula. The selection was random in the deep sense. The person with every inner resource could be selected for the wrong line, and was. But the quality of the days that followed the selection, the quality of the inner life that continued to exist even in the most extreme conditions, was not random. It was a function, in part, of what the person had developed in the years before the arrival. This is the lesson Frankl drew for his patients after the war. The work of building the inner life, of developing the relationship with meaning, is not something to be deferred. It is the most essential preparation for everything else. Let the body rest. We continue. In the autumn of 1944, Viktor Frankl arrived at Auschwitz. The train had been traveling for days. The car was overcrowded, the air unbreathable, the space so compressed that it was impossible to sit and barely possible to stand. People lost consciousness. People died. The train did not stop for this. When the doors opened, there was noise and light and a crowd of prisoners in striped clothing moving people into lines. The selection was fast. An officer walked the line. A gesture to the left, a gesture to the right. Frankl did not know in that moment what the gestures meant. He knew enough to be terrified. He had heard rumors. But the reality of it, the speed of it, the ordinariness of the face making the gestures, the absence of any ceremony around decisions of such magnitude, this he could not have been prepared for. He was gestured to the right. His father, who was with him, was gestured to the left. He never saw his father again. What Frankl later wrote about the first days is not what you might expect. There is not much rage. There is something closer to observation, the psychologist's instinct to watch even when the watcher is in danger. He noticed the way people reorganized their sense of what was possible, the way the mind performed a kind of triage, releasing certain futures so it could function in the present one. He noticed something else. He noticed that the men who seemed to deteriorate most quickly were not always the ones in the worst physical condition. They were sometimes the men who had lost the thread, who could not locate the specific, particular reason that made surviving worth the cost. He was forming the evidence for an argument he had been building since the 1930s. The argument was about meaning, and here, in Auschwitz, it was being tested in conditions that had no precedent. Nothing you are carrying tonight requires this kind of courage. But the question is the same. The question is always the same. What is it, specifically, that makes tomorrow worth starting? We continue. Chapter 8, the question he asked first. He asked it differently in different contexts. In the formal therapeutic setting, he might ask it as a clinical question, with clipboard and professional distance. In a more conversational mode, he might ask it as a simple curiosity. What are you looking forward to? But the function of the question was always the same. He was not interested in what the patient said they wanted in the abstract. He was interested in what their face did when they imagined it. He was watching for the small, involuntary movement, the breath that shifted, the expression that changed, that indicated contact with something real. He had developed a sensitivity to this kind of contact through years of practice. He could hear the difference between the performed answer, the one the patient gave because it was the correct thing to say in a therapist's office, and the genuine one. The performed answer came smoothly and quickly. The genuine answer often arrived with a pause, and sometimes with a quality of surprise. "What is waiting for you?" And the patient goes quiet, and then says, "My grandson's birthday. He's turning 7 next month." That is it. That is the thread. Not the grand narrative about what the life was for. The specific, small, particular thing. The 7-year-old birthday, the thread leads there, and from there, wherever it needs to go. Frankl believed the therapy of logotherapy was, in its essence, helping the person follow the thread. The thread was always already there. The work was learning to feel it. There is a question Viktor Frankl asked at the beginning of almost every therapeutic relationship. Not what is wrong, not what are your symptoms, not how long have you felt this way. Those were his colleagues' questions. They were good questions. He asked them too, in time. But the first question, the one he asked before anything else, the one he used to orient himself and the patient toward the work, was different. He asked, "What is waiting for you?" Or, in some versions, "What would happen if you were not here?" Not as a challenge, not as a provocation, as a genuine question. What is there in your actual life that is waiting for your specific presence? A person, a task, a question only you can answer, a work only you can complete, a relationship that requires you specifically and not someone interchangeable. Most people, when they heard the question for the first time, went quiet. Not because they could not answer it, because the answer, when they found it, surprised them with its specificity. It was rarely the grand thing. It was rarely the achievement or the status or the narrative they had told themselves about why their life mattered. It was the small thing, the particular thing, the thing that only they knew mattered and that they had been taking for granted. Frankl believed, and his clinical evidence bore this out across decades of practice, that the human being is not primarily seeking happiness. The human being is primarily seeking meaning. And meaning is found not in general, but in specific. In this task, this person, this obligation, this unrepeatable and irreplaceable moment. Hold that question somewhere near you tonight. We will not answer it now, but you will feel it working. What is waiting for you? Let the body soften, let the breath move. You do not need to answer anything tonight. We continue. Chapter 9, Tilly. He described her in terms that were precise without being cold. The quality of her attention when she was listening, the particular way she held her head, the specific texture of her presence in a room, not loud, not dominant, but the room would have been different without her in it. He had met her in conditions of increasing danger. The Vienna of the early 1940s was a city where Jewish professionals were being stripped of their positions, their property, their futures. He and Tilly were already carrying the knowledge that the world they had expected to inhabit was contracting. And they married anyway, and they chose to be together anyway. In the specific and particular way that choosing implies, with full knowledge of the conditions and with the choice made regardless. He later wrote that this was itself an act of meaning. To choose, in conditions of uncertainty and danger, to be with another person and to love them in the full sense, to allow their irreplaceability to actually matter to you, is to enact the second path in its most exposed form. It is experience in the sense that Frankl meant something genuinely allowed to land. He thought of her in the camps, and the thought was not abstract comfort, it was specific. She had said a particular thing once that he kept returning to. He did not record what the thing was. He was too careful a writer to manufacture that kind of sentiment. But the returning to it, the specificity of the memory, was itself sustaining. The lamp burns for someone. That is what he learned. The lamp needs a direction. Before the camps, Viktor Frankl had fallen in love. Her name was Tilly Grosser. They had met through mutual friends. In the Vienna of the early 1940s, a city that was already changed, already frightened, already emptying of the people it could not protect. They were married in December 1941. 9 months later, they were deported to Theresienstadt together. What Frankl wrote about Tilly in Man's Search for Meaning is not romanticized. He was too precise for that. He wrote about the experience of thinking of her in the camps, specifically the way her image arrived without being summoned. He would be walking the frozen ground of the camp in the morning, forced to move in a column toward a work site, the temperature below zero, the guards on the perimeter, and he would find that he was speaking to her. Not in words, exactly, in something that functioned like presence, her face, her voice, the particular quality of her attention when she listened to him. He wrote that in those moments he understood something about love that the philosophy books had not quite captured. That love is not merely an emotional state, but something more like a mode of perception. That to love a person is, among other things, to perceive them as irreplaceable, to understand that their specific existence matters in a way that cannot be substituted. He later learned that Tilly had died at Bergen-Belsen in the spring of 1945, a few weeks before the war's end. He had survived in part by holding her image. He had carried her presence across 2 years of conditions that were designed to reduce people to their animal needs. And she had already been gone. He wrote about this without accusation and without collapse. He wrote about it as data. The love had been real. The sustaining quality of it had been real. The fact that she did not survive did not retrospectively empty it of meaning. This is a hard idea. We do not need to resolve it tonight. Let it sit. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight of the body. We go on. Chapter 10. What the mind does with impossibility. Psychologists who have studied extreme survival have consistently found that what distinguishes the person who maintains function under catastrophic conditions from the person who does not is not primarily strength of character in the person, conventional sense. It is not toughness, not stoicism, not the absence of feeling. It is the capacity to locate a future. The person who can imagine any version of tomorrow, any specific, particular version, even a modest one, tends to behave differently from the person who cannot. The person who cannot imagine tomorrow tends to stop making decisions that would matter to the person who arrives there. The future has become too uncertain or too painful to look at, and so the present loses its orientation. Frankl called this finding its name in the camps. He watched men who lost the thread of the future, who stopped being able to locate even a provisional tomorrow, decline in ways that were visible and rapid. The body participated in the collapse, and he watched the reverse. The man who had, somewhere, a task, a promise, a face. The man who was pointed at something specific. However tentatively, this man stood differently. Not with optimism, which would have been delusional, with direction. And direction turned out to be, in extremity, nearly as important as food. He brought this finding back to the clinic. He applied it to patients in comfortable rooms, carrying comfortable griefs. The finding held. The capacity to locate a future, any genuine future, however modest, is the most portable form of resilience available. Let the breath move. We continue. The psychologist Abraham Maslow mapped a hierarchy of needs. At the base, food, water, warmth, safety. Only when these are met, he argued, can the higher needs become active, belonging, esteem, and at the apex, what he called self-actualization. The realization of one's potential. Frankl respected Maslow, but in Auschwitz he observed something that complicated the hierarchy. People at the base level, people whose physical needs were catastrophically unmet, who were cold and hungry and in constant danger, were still, some of them, asking the highest level questions, still finding meaning in small acts, still composing music in their heads, or telling stories, or performing tiny kindnesses for one another that cost them energy they could not afford to spare. And some people who had been given food and relative warmth, people in the administrative positions of the camp, people who had made arrangements that kept them safer, had collapsed at the meaning level, had stopped asking, had stopped trying to perceive the world as anything other than a mechanism to be survived by any means necessary. Frankl concluded that the hunger for meaning is not a luxury that appears only when the basic hungers are satisfied. It is primary. It is what the brain reaches for, at some level, under almost any conditions. The question is not whether human beings seek meaning. The question is whether they know how to find it. Here is the clinical observation that surprised him most. The people in the camps who could articulate a specific reason for surviving, a task, a person, an obligation, did not necessarily survive. The survival rate was not a function of intention, but they seemed to suffer differently. They seemed to retain, under conditions of extremity, something that was not quite hope, but was adjacent to it. A directionality, a sense that tomorrow was pointed somewhere rather than merely arriving. He called this attitudinal meaning, the meaning that one takes toward a situation one cannot change. The attitude one brings to suffering when the suffering itself cannot be removed. This is the third path. We will come to it properly later, but keep it nearby. Feel the weight of the body. You do not need to follow every word tonight. The parts that matter will find you. Chapter 11. Kierkegaard and the Cost of Being Free. He also wrote about the 3 stages of life, a framework he developed in Either, Or, and related works. The first stage is the aesthetic, the life lived for pleasure, for sensation, for the moment. It is not stupid or wrong. It is simply insufficient, because the person who lives only for sensation discovers that sensation itself does not accumulate into anything. Each pleasure ends. The next one must be found. The aesthetic life is a life of searching for the next thing. The second stage is the ethical, the life lived according to duty, obligation, the requirements of the social world. The person here has found a structure that the aesthetic life lacked. They do what they are supposed to do. They fulfill their obligations. They are, by external measure, a good person. But Kierkegaard thought this stage was also insufficient, because it still lacked something essential, the personal. The life lived purely according to duty is lived for others rather than from the self. The third stage, which Kierkegaard thought only some people reached, and only through a kind of leap, was the religious stage. Not religion in the institutional sense. The stage of the person who has, through suffering or insight or what he could only call grace, arrived at an authentic relationship with their own existence. The person who is not performing life but living it. Frankl saw this structure and recognized it. The aesthetic life is the life that avoids the question. The ethical life manages the question. The third stage names it and lives in it. Let the breath move. We go on. Søren Kierkegaard was born in Copenhagen in 1813. He died there in 1855. In the 42 years between, he produced a body of work that would not be widely read until after his death, translated into German, and then taken up by the generation that had to rebuild meaning from the rubble of the First World War. He was not a cheerful man. He walked Copenhagen obsessively, miles a day, through every neighborhood, talking to shopkeepers and students and children, absorbing the texture of a city that never quite felt like home. He was deeply religious and deeply afraid of what his religion required. He was betrothed to a woman named Regine Olsen and broke the engagement in a decision that seems to have caused him permanent grief, because he believed he could not give her the kind of ordinary life she deserved. He wrote about anxiety before the word had its modern clinical sense. Anxiety, he wrote in The Concept of Anxiety, published in 1844, is the dizziness of freedom. He was not describing a pathology, he was describing a condition. The condition of being the kind of creature that must choose, that cannot not choose, and that understands, at some level, that every choice is also an act of becoming. To choose is to become the person who chose that. And that is terrifying, if you take it seriously. Frankl took Kierkegaard seriously. He saw in that anxiety not something to be treated away, but something to be understood and carefully used. The person who is anxious about their freedom is a person who has not yet deadened themselves to the significance of what they are doing. They are suffering, yes, but they are suffering from being alive in the full sense. The alternative, the person who has stopped feeling the anxiety, who has settled into a life without choice by choosing the same thing every day until it stops feeling like a choice, is, in Kierkegaard's view, not in a better condition. They are simply in a different kind of danger. Let your jaw soften, let the breath come and go. Kierkegaard walked Copenhagen in the dark. Frankl walked the frozen ground of Auschwitz. Both were trying to understand the same thing, what it costs to be genuinely free and whether the cost is worth it. We continue. Chapter 12, The Quiet Work of the Body. The philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a French phenomenologist who was Frankl's near contemporary, spent his career developing an account of the human being that refused to separate the mind from the body. Not in the reductive direction, not the claim that the mind is nothing but chemistry, that thought is only neurons. In the opposite direction, the claim that the body itself thinks, perceives, orientates, knows. He called this the lived body. Not the body as object, as a thing that occupies space and can be described anatomically, the body as the way of being in the world. The body that reaches toward what it loves and recoils from what it fears, that settles toward the familiar and stiffens toward the threatening, before any conscious calculation has had time to form. Frankl would have recognized this from the clinic. He observed that the body of the patient who had found the thread was different from the body of the patient who had not. Not dramatically different, subtly different. A quality of settledness, a different relationship with the chair they were sitting in, the table between them, the room they were sharing. He did not have Merleau-Ponty's vocabulary for it. He was working from clinical observation rather than philosophy. But he was watching the same thing, the way the body participates in the question of meaning and the way it reports on the progress of the search. Tonight, the body is resting. Let it. Eat. There is something the body knows before the mind catches up. Viktor Frankl noticed it in his patients long before he noticed it in himself. The people who came to his clinic with the second kind of emptiness, the existential vacuum, the hollow feeling in the middle of an otherwise functioning life, often described a specific physical quality to it. A heaviness, a slowing. Not the sudden, acute weight of grief, but something more like the weight of water, all surrounding and without direction. He also noticed the opposite. The people who had found the thread, who had located, however tentatively, a reason that felt specific and real, described something different in the body. Not euphoria, not the excitement of a new project. Something quieter, a sense of moving toward rather than simply moving. The body is not separate from the question of meaning. It participates in the answer. Philosophers have argued about this for centuries. Descartes drew a line between the thinking self and the extended physical body. The mind trapped in the machine, the ghost in the shell. Most of those who came after him have spent their time arguing against that line, pointing out that the self is not floating above its body, but woven into it, that thought and sensation and posture and breath are not separate channels, but one entangled thing. Frankl had a simpler version of this argument. He observed that his patients who could not find meaning often stopped standing up straight. It was not symbolic. It was not something they chose. The body expressed the inner condition before the mind could articulate it. And, conversely, the person who decided, in whatever provisional and imperfect way, to reach towards something tended to stand slightly differently. A small thing, the kind of thing you would not notice in a single moment. But over days, over weeks, it accumulated into something visible. Your breath is moving on its own. The room is still. Nothing here is asking you to change anything. But notice, if you will, what your body is doing with this quiet. Let it soften where it can. We go on. Chapter 13. Seneca counting the hours. Seneca was not, to be honest about it, a particularly admirable man. He was one of the wealthiest people in the Roman Empire, and he acquired that wealth through means he was never fully transparent about. He advised a tyrant and enabled him. He was exiled for reasons he denied, returned for reasons he partially acknowledged, and eventually ordered to die by the person he had advised. He knew all of this about himself. He wrote about it in his letters with an honesty that is somewhat startling given his position. "I am telling you all of this," he wrote to his friend Lucilius in one of the letters, "because I believe a person who has not made the mistakes he is warning against is the wrong person to be giving the warning. And I have made every mistake I am warning you about." This is what gives his writing its particular texture. It is not the philosophy of someone who has gotten it right. It is the philosophy of someone who has not gotten it right, who knows it, and who is trying to get it less wrong before time runs out. Frankl respected this quality in Seneca. He had lived among people who claimed authority they had not earned. The authority of honest reckoning with one's own failures struck him as more useful clinically and philosophically than the authority of the person who had arranged their life to look correct. The person who is awake at midnight reviewing their failures is, in Seneca's view, not doing something pathological. They are doing the necessary thing. The question is whether the review leads anywhere. Let the breath move. We go on. Lucius Annaeus Seneca was born around 4 BCE in Cordoba, in what is now Spain. He became one of the wealthiest men in the Roman Empire, a tutor and advisor to the Emperor Nero, and eventually was ordered by that same emperor to kill himself. He did so in 65 CE by the method of his choosing. In between those bookends, he wrote some of the most lucid prose about time ever produced. On the Shortness of Life is not a long book. It is a letter, really, addressed to his friend Paulinus. In it, Seneca makes an argument that at first sounds like a complaint and then reveals itself as something much sharper. Life is not short, he says. We have been given a great deal of it. What is short is the life we actually inhabit. The rest is wasted. It is not that we have a short time to live, he wrote, but that we waste a great deal of it. He was specific about the waste. Not the waste of idleness, though he addresses that, the waste of busyness, the waste of collecting things, the waste of planning a future life while the present one slips by. The waste of living for the approval of others while your own hours drain away. He wrote about people who saved their whole lives for a retirement they never reached, about men who spent decades climbing toward a position of honor that they did not enjoy once they arrived, about the kind of hurry that keeps a person moving so fast they never look at what they are moving through. He was 60 years old when he wrote it. He had made every mistake he described. Viktor Frankl read the Stoics. He taught the Stoics. He saw in Seneca's argument a confirmation of what he was finding in the clinic. The person who lives as if they have infinite time tends to find at some point that they do not. And the recognition arrives too late to change the shape of the hours that remain. But Frankl added something Seneca did not quite say. The problem is not only that we waste time, the problem is that we waste it on things that do not align with what we actually value. And the reason we do not know what we actually value is that we have never been still enough to ask. Tonight is a kind of stillness. Let it work. Chapter 14. How Meaning Differs from Happiness. William James, the American philosopher and psychologist, made an observation in 1902 that maps neatly onto Frankl's argument. James wrote about what he called the will to believe, not in the purely religious sense, but in the broader sense of the human being's need to commit to something before the evidence is in. The person who waits for certainty before committing to anything tends to find that certainty never quite arrives, and in the waiting, the life passes. Frankl's version of this: the person who waits to feel meaningful before acting meaningfully tends to wait indefinitely. The feeling follows the action, not always, not reliably. But the sequence act toward meaning, feel the meaning in the acting, is far more reliable than the sequence feel the meaning first, then act. The happiness researchers have confirmed this through different means. The studies on hedonic adaptation, the tendency for humans to return to roughly the same set point of felt well-being, regardless of what happens to them externally, suggests that pursuing happiness directly tends to be self-defeating, because the thing pursued keeps moving. What does not move, or moves less, is the sense that one's life is pointed at something real. The sense of engagement, direction, and purpose is more stable, it turns out, than any particular feeling. This is not a popular observation in a culture that has made the pursuit of feeling its central project, but it is a well-documented one. Frankl arrived at it through philosophy and clinical work. The researchers arrived at it through measurement. They converged on the same thing. Direction matters more than arrival. Here is an important distinction, and it is worth taking slowly. Viktor Frankl did not teach people to be happy. He did not believe happiness was a goal one could usefully pursue. He believed, and his clinical work supported this over 5 decades of practice, that the direct pursuit of happiness tends to undermine itself. The person who wakes up each morning and asks, "Am I happy yet?" is less likely to arrive at happiness than the person who is absorbed in something and discovers happiness there as a byproduct when they look up. He called this the paradox of pleasure, and he saw it in its most extreme form in a particular kind of patient. the person who had achieved everything they had aimed for and was miserable in direct proportion to how clearly they could see that they had succeeded. Happiness, Frankl argued, is a result. It is not a method. It cannot be manufactured. It can only be found, and it tends to be found, as a consequence of living towards something larger than oneself. A task, a person, a value, rather than as a consequence of optimizing directly for the feeling of it. Meaning, on the other hand, is available even in conditions where happiness is impossible. This is not a comfortable observation, but it is what Frankl found in the camps, and it is what he spent the rest of his life trying to explain. A person can find meaning in the middle of suffering, not by calling the suffering good, not by pretending it does not hurt, but by understanding that the human response to suffering, what one does with it, what attitude one brings to it, how one stands in relation to it, is itself a kind of freedom, and that this freedom is the one thing no external force can remove. He was not romanticizing the camps. He was precise about what he was saying. He was saying that even in a place where happiness was not available, something else was, and that something else was sustaining in a way that happiness, even in good times, was not. The something else was a sense that this life, this suffering, this moment mattered, that it was pointed at something rather than simply occurring. Let the breath move, let the body rest. We continue. Chapter 15, Camus and the Honest Question. Camus wrote The Myth of Sisyphus in Algeria and Paris during the German occupation, in conditions of danger and uncertainty that gave his abstract argument a specific weight. He was not sitting in a comfortable study debating suicide as an intellectual proposition. He was writing in a country that had been occupied, among people who were dying, about the most fundamental question one can ask in such conditions. He distinguished between what he called physical suicide and philosophical suicide. Physical suicide is the obvious case, the person who decides life is not worth the effort and removes themselves from it. Philosophical suicide is what he thought most philosophy had done. Resolve the unbearable tension of the absurd by positing a meaning that was not honestly arrived at, a god, a progress, a historical telos that made the question disappear rather than answering it. He respected physical suicide as a serious position. He rejected it for himself. And he rejected philosophical suicide as dishonest. His response, defiance, revolt, the willingness to push the boulder knowing it will roll back down, has been criticized for being emotionally insufficient. Frankl made this criticism himself, that defiance, however admirable, is not the same as meaning, and that the person who needs meaning cannot be satisfied with the posture of the person who has settled for defiance. But Camus had done something important. He had refused to take the easy way out. He had started from the most honest possible position. And any genuine engagement with the question of meaning has to start from the same place. Let the breath move. Let the room be still. Albert Camus was born in Algeria in 1913. He died in a car accident in France in 1960. In the 47 years between, he asked one question with more precision and more honesty than almost anyone before or after him. The question is, why go on? He asked it without flinching and without the comfort of a predetermined answer. In The Myth of Sisyphus, published in 1942, the same year Frankl was deported to Theresienstadt, Camus began with what he called the only truly serious philosophical question: suicide. Not as an endorsement, as a starting point for honesty. If life has no meaning, he said, then the question of whether to continue it is a genuine question, and no honest philosophy can skip past it. He named the feeling of this question the absurd, not meaninglessness, absurdity. The tension between the human need for order, significance, and reason, and the universe's perfect indifference to that need. The universe does not answer, the human being keeps asking. That gap is the absurd. And Camus' answer, his own answer, not Frankl's, was not that the absurd can be resolved. It cannot. But it can be met. It can be met with defiance rather than surrender. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, he wrote, in the most quoted line of the book. Not because pushing the boulder is pleasant, but because the act of pushing, undertaken with full awareness and without self-deception, is itself a form of freedom. Frankl disagreed with Camus on one crucial point. He believed meaning was real, not merely a defiant posture in the face of meaninglessness. He thought Camus stopped one step short. But he respected the honesty of the question. He thought anyone who had not asked it seriously had not yet started. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. That line. Let it sit for a moment, and let your shoulders drop. Let the jaw soften. You do not need to push any boulder tonight. Chapter 16, The First Path, Creation. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke, writing in his Letters to a Young Poet, a correspondence that began in 1903 and has been read by artists of every kind for over a century since, gave advice about creative work that Frankl would have recognized from a different angle. Rilke told the young poet not to ask whether he was a good poet. He told him to ask, would you die if you could not write? Not as a dramatic question, as a diagnostic one. The thing you would die without is the thing that is genuinely yours. Everything else is what you are doing while you are figuring out what is genuinely yours. He was describing the first path in the vocabulary of necessity. The thing you would die without is the thing that has become, in some sense, your meaning. Not because it provides a comfortable living or external validation, it may not, but because the not doing it represents a form of inner starvation that you cannot sustain indefinitely. Frankl said something similar in clinical terms. The patient who could not identify the specific thing they could not live without was the patient still searching for the first path. And the work of the therapy was not to tell them what it was, the therapist cannot know that, but to help them find conditions of honesty in which they could discover it themselves. What is the thing you would not want to give up. Not forever. Not in the global sense. Just this week, if you had to choose one thing to hold on to, what would it be? That thing is on the first path. Viktor Frankl identified 3 paths by which a human being can find meaning. He was not offering a menu. He was offering an observation about how meaning actually works, derived from watching thousands of people move toward it and away from it over the course of a clinical career. The first path is creation. What we give to the world, what we make, what we do. This is the path most people think of first when they think of meaningful lives. The artist, the builder, the teacher, the person who plants a tree, the doctor who heals, the parent who raises a child, the craftsperson who makes the thing that outlasts them. Frankl was careful not to restrict this to grand gestures. He observed that the meaning available through creation is not proportional to the scale of the thing created. A meal cooked with care for someone who is lonely. A letter written to a friend who has lost something. A shelf built level and true. A garden kept. These are acts of creation in the relevant sense, and they carry the same structure of meaning as the masterwork, even if they carry it in a smaller vessel. What matters in the first path is the giving, the turning of the self outward towards something beyond the self, the making of something that did not exist before and would not exist without this particular effort, applied at this particular moment. He also observed something about creative work that the culture of productivity tends to miss. The meaning does not arrive at the end. It is present in the doing. The carpenter who is absorbed in the joint is not waiting for the furniture to be finished before meaning becomes available. The meaning is there in the measurement, the cut, the fitting, the adjustment. The completed object is not the source of it, the work is. This matters for the person lying awake, feeling that nothing they do adds up to anything significant. The test is not scale, the test is direction. Is the effort turned outward? Is it given? Is it specific? Let the breath move. Let the body settle. 1 path down, 2 more to come. We go on. Chapter 17, Marcus Aurelius on the Danube. He was also managing a plague. The Antonine Plague, which had arrived from the Eastern campaigns in 165 CE and was still moving through the empire nearly a decade later, had killed perhaps 5 million people. Marcus had watched it take members of his court, his family, the populations of cities he had never visited. He had administered the relief efforts. He had written letters of condolence. He had made decisions about quarantine and grain supply and troop deployment in conditions where every decision affected thousands of people, and none of the information was reliable. And at night he wrote to himself about whether his judgments had been correct. Not the military or administrative judgments, the inner ones. Was he doing what he genuinely thought was right, or what appeared right? Was he governing from principle, or from the fear of appearing to fail? Was the equanimity he projected on the throne genuine, or a performance? He was severe with himself in these interrogations. He did not let himself off easily, but he did not collapse into self-accusation either. The tone of the meditations is something harder to achieve than either of those. The tone of honest self-examination that remains somehow good-humored. A man looking at himself without flinching and without drama. Frankl had this quality too in his clinical writing. He wrote about his own experience in the camps without sensationalizing it and without turning it into proof of his own virtue. He was precise. He was honest about what he had felt and what he had done and what he wished he had done differently. Both men were practicing the same thing. The examined life maintained under conditions that made examination difficult. The tent on the Danube, the barrack in the camp. In the winter of 170 CE, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius was camped on the Danube frontier, managing a war he had not chosen and did not want. He was in his late 40s by then. He had been emperor for nearly a decade. He had inherited a position of absolute power, and he had spent almost all of it away from the city he loved, managing crises he had not designed. A plague that moved through the empire, killing hundreds of thousands. Incursions from the north and east. The endless, grinding administrative weight of being responsible for 40 million people who did not know his name but depended on his decisions. At night, in his tent, he wrote, not dispatches, not strategic plans. Something stranger and more private. A journal addressed to himself in the second person that functioned as a kind of ongoing argument with his own tendencies. You could leave life right now, he wrote in one entry. Let that determine what you do and say and think, not as a morbid thought, as a clarifying one. The man was practicing the awareness of his own finitude as a technique for living more attentively in the present moment. He wrote in Greek, not Latin, though he governed a Latin-speaking empire. Greek was the language of philosophy, of private thought, of the self he kept separate from the role. The journal was never intended for anyone else. It was discovered after his death and published under the title Meditations, a word he never used. He called the entries simply to himself. What Marcus Aurelius and Viktor Frankl share is not superficial. Both men occupied positions of enormous public responsibility while conducting an intensely private inquiry into what made the burden of that responsibility sustainable. Both men concluded that the sustainability of the outer life depended on the quality of the inner one. Both men believed that the inner life was a practice, not a given, something cultivated through daily attention, not something one simply had or did not have. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "How much more grievous are the consequences of anger than the causes of it." He was not writing for posterity. He was writing to keep himself honest in a life that kept offering him reasons to be dishonest. Frankl did the same thing on stolen scraps of paper in Auschwitz. The tent on the Danube, the barrack in the camp. Two men separated by 18 centuries and everything else, trying to understand what the self owes to its own continued existence. Both of them concluded something. That something has a shape, and it is worth knowing. Let your breath move. Feel the body where it rests. We are in the second hour now. You do not need to follow every word. Let the parts that matter find you. Chapter 18. The second path. Experience. The Japanese aesthetic concept of mono-no-aware, often translated as the pathos of things or the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, names something adjacent to what Frankl meant by experience. As a path to meaning, the cherry blossoms fall in a week. The Japanese have a word for the feeling of watching them fall, aware. It is not sadness exactly. It is not nostalgia exactly. It is something like the felt awareness that this beauty is happening and will be over, and that its transience is inseparable from its quality. The blossoms that lasted forever would not be the same thing. The person who allows this feeling in, who does not manage it or file it, is practicing the second path, whether or not they have Frankl's vocabulary for it. They are letting something land. They are allowing the world to do something to them. Frankl observed that the capacity for this kind of experience tends to erode under sustained stress and overwork. Not dramatically, not all at once. Gradually, the person who has been in crisis mode for long enough, dealing with the immediate demands of a life under pressure, begins to process beauty and love and truth as information rather than experience. The cherry blossoms are noted and categorized. The loved person's face is recognized and not fully seen. This erosion is not a character defect. It is a protective response. Under sustained demand, the opening through which experience reaches the interior narrows down. The system is protecting itself. The problem is that the narrowing closes the second path. Let the breath move, we go on. Viktor Frankl's second path to meaning is called experience. What we receive from the world, what we allow in, what we witness and permit to actually touch us. He was specific about this. Experience in the relevant sense is not merely sensory input. It is not simply having been in the presence of something beautiful or true. The experience that opens the second path is experience that is allowed to land, that is not processed and filed away before it has had time to do anything to the person receiving it. He wrote about beauty as a form of meaning, about the moment in the camps in the worst period when a fellow prisoner nudged him awake before dawn and pointed at the window. The sky was on fire with a sunrise that turned the grey barrack rooftops to something the men stood watching in silence, exhausted and cold and hungry, and could not reduce to mere spectacle. Something in them opened to it. They permitted themselves, for a few minutes, to be people who found a sunrise beautiful. He wrote about that moment without sentimentality. He was not saying the beauty made the suffering acceptable. He was saying that beauty, permitted to land, is itself a form of meaning, that the capacity to receive it, to let it through the defenses of a self that has every reason to close down, is one of the most resilient human capacities there is. The second path also runs through love. Not romantic love exclusively, though that too, the love that perceives another person as irreplaceable and allows that perception to matter. The parent who watches their child across a room. The friend who has known you long enough to remember who you were before you knew how to hide things. The experience of being genuinely seen by someone and the rarer experience of genuinely seeing. He also included the experience of truth, the moment when an idea arrives that reorganizes what was previously unclear, the sudden legibility of something that had been opaque, the feeling of a sentence landing in a book, in a conversation, in one's own thinking, that names something previously unnameable. All of these are the second path. They are available, Frankl insisted, in almost any circumstances. Not always easily, not always fully, but available. The person who says they have no access to meaning via experience has usually, through grief or exhaustion or habit, stopped permitting things to land. The question is not whether there is anything worth experiencing. The question is whether the door is open. Nothing you hear tonight is asking you to open it wider than is comfortable, but notice whether it is ajar. Let the room be quiet. We continue. Chapter 19. Yalom and the dying patient. Yalom's clinical finding that confronting death makes life more vivid has a name in the research literature: mortality salience. Psychologists have conducted hundreds of experiments designed to understand what happens to human cognition and behavior when people are reminded of their own finitude, however briefly. The findings are complicated and sometimes counterintuitive. Mortality, salience, sometimes triggers defensiveness. The person reminded of their death grasps more tightly at the beliefs and group memberships that feel like shields against meaninglessness. This is the less useful response. But under certain conditions, specifically, when the person has developed what the researchers call a secure attachment to their own values, mortality salience does something different. It functions as a clarifier. The person reminded of finitude tends, under these conditions, to report greater appreciation for the people in their life, greater willingness to pursue genuinely important goals at the expense of merely comfortable ones, and a reduction in the petty grievances and low-level dissatisfactions that fill the space when finitude is not visible. Yalom's dying patients had arrived, through their diagnoses, at a sustained version of this state, and many of them were reporting, paradoxically, that they felt more alive. The clinical question he kept asking was, what is it about the diagnosis that produced this? And could that thing be accessed without the diagnosis? His answer, arrived at over 50 years of practice, was, with effort and honesty, yes. The diagnosis is a delivery system. The thing it delivers, awareness of finitude, which concentrates attention on what matters, can be accessed through deliberate practice. Frankl had his own delivery system. The camps were more extreme. The finding was the same. Irvin Yalom is a psychiatrist. He was born in Washington, D.C. in 1931. He has spent the better part of 7 decades sitting with patients in what he calls existential crisis. Not crisis in the dramatic, acute sense, but the kind that accumulates quietly in people who have been too busy or too careful. to think clearly about their own mortality. He is known for a particular observation that he reached after years of working with patients who had received terminal diagnoses. He noticed that many of them, in the period after the diagnosis and before the end, reported a strange quality of experience. Some of them described feeling more alive than they had at any point in their adult lives. Not happier, not free of fear or sadness, but more present, more willing to say what they actually thought, more capable of the first path and the second path, as Frankl would have put it, more genuinely creating and more genuinely receiving. They had stopped worrying about whether the relationship was going in the right direction and started being in it. They had stopped deferring the conversation they had been meaning to have and had it. They had stopped decorating the surface of their days with plans for a future that now had a visible boundary, and started paying attention to the texture of the day itself. Yalom asked the obvious question: if the awareness of death makes life more vivid, what would it take to access that vividness without the death sentence? Is it possible to live with what he calls mortality salience, a genuine daily awareness of finitude without being crushed by it? His answer was, carefully, it is possible. And the clinician's job was not to protect patients from thinking about death, but to help them think about it clearly enough that it functioned as a teacher rather than a torment. Frankl had reached similar conclusions from different evidence. The camps had given him a very direct relationship with finitude. He wrote that the person who has genuinely confronted the fact of their own death is rarely the person lying awake cataloguing grievances. That person has usually done the work of sorting what mattered from what seemed to matter. The awareness of death is not an enemy of meaning. Used with care, it is one of its best instruments. Feel the breath move. Let the jaw soften. This is not a dark thought. It is a clarifying one. We continue. Chapter 20, The Empty Win. The social psychologist Csikszentmihalyi identified a related phenomenon in his research on flow. He found that people often report their lowest states of well-being not during periods of demand or difficulty, but during the periods of leisure that follow them. The person who works intensely toward a goal and then achieves it often experiences a brief period of positive affect, followed by something more complicated. The structure that the goal provided, the daily direction, the sense of working towards something, disappears with its achievement, and the person, suddenly without the organizing principle that had been shaping their days, finds themselves in a version of the Sunday without plans that lasts longer and feels more disorienting because it was supposed to feel like freedom. Csikszentmihalyi called this the post-vacation blues, but the phenomenon is broader than vacations. It affects people after retirement, after the completion of long projects, after the arrival of life stages that were supposed to represent the destination. Frankl's framework offers a specific diagnosis. The goal that was pursued was proximate. It was the means to meaning rather than meaning itself. And when the proximate goal is achieved, the person discovers that the meaning they were expecting to find at the end was not stored there waiting for them. It was something that had to be located in the actual living, not in the arrival. The prescription is not to stop setting goals. It is to understand them correctly as structures that provide temporary direction while the deeper search continues. The meaning is in the searching, not in the destination the search is pointed at. Feel the breath move. The room is still. There is a particular experience that a significant number of people report and that no one talks about very much because it is embarrassing in the way that only privileged suffering can be embarrassing. You work for something for years, a degree, a promotion, a business built from nothing, a relationship arrived at after a long search, a creative project finally finished. And then the thing happens, the promotion, the degree, the opening night, the signing, the wedding, and you look around at the moment of arrival, and the feeling that was supposed to be there is not quite there. There is something, relief, often a kind of loosening, but not the satisfaction that was supposed to accompany success, not the sense of completion, just the next day. And then the one after that. Viktor Frankl had a name for this. He saw it constantly in his practice, and he saw it as a specific form of the existential vacuum, not the general emptiness that comes from having no direction. The targeted emptiness that comes from having pursued the wrong direction with great determination and arrived somewhere that turned out to be the wrong place. He was not unsympathetic. He understood that the culture a person grows up in teaches them what to want. The culture teaches that success in its particular shape is the right goal. And the person pursues it honestly, works for it genuinely, earns it legitimately, and then stands in the middle of what they worked for, feeling a puzzling absence. The absence is telling them something. It is telling them that the goal they reached was not, at the deepest level, theirs. It was proximate. It was the thing that was supposed to lead to meaning rather than be meaning. And they have confused the signpost for the destination. Frankl's clinical prescription for this was not to abandon success. It was to trace the thread backward. If this is not what I was actually reaching for, what was I actually reaching for? Not in the global sense, what is the meaning of my life, but in the specific sense. What did I imagine I would feel in the moment of arrival that I do not now feel, and what actually produces that feeling? This is uncomfortable work. It is also, he believed, the most useful work a person can do with the quiet that comes after an empty win. The room is still. Nothing here asks you to answer that question tonight. But notice if it has ever been your experience. And if it has, know that it is data, not failure. We continue. Chapter 21, The Third Path. What cannot be taken. The philosopher Viktor Frankl had a model in the camps who influenced his thinking in ways he acknowledged for the rest of his life. It was not another philosopher. It was a woman whose name he never knew, a young woman who had been sentenced to die and who, in the days before her death, demonstrated something Frankl found himself unable to fully account for in the frameworks he had available. She was cheerful, not in the manic or dissociated sense, in the genuine sense. She spoke to the other prisoners with care. She expressed gratitude, specifically for the particular quality of light coming through the window of the barrack. She said, and Frankl recorded this, that the tree she could see through the window was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and that she spoke to it. He asked her about this. She said, "I am dying and I know it, and so I am trying to use the time that remains to see clearly. And what I see clearly is that the tree is extraordinary, and that the light is extraordinary, and that I have been in the presence of extraordinary things for most of my life without noticing them." This is the third path. Not the refusal to suffer, not the performance of equanimity. The genuine arrival at a relationship with one's circumstances that is more than the sum of those circumstances. The attitude that finds, even in the worst conditions, something to receive. She died. Frankl did not. He carried the story for 50 years. Let the breath move. We continue. The third path is the hardest one to name, and the one Frankl was most certain about. He had evidence for the first path, creation, that any clinician might gather. Patients who poured themselves into meaningful work recovered faster from depression, anxiety, the existential vacuum. This was not surprising. He had evidence for the second path, experience, that was harder to gather but consistent. The capacity to be moved by beauty, by love, by truth, seemed to function as a buffer against the worst effects of meaninglessness. The third path was the one he discovered in the camps, and it could not have been discovered anywhere else. He called it attitudinal meaning, the meaning one takes toward unavoidable suffering. He was careful about what he was saying here. He was not saying that suffering is good. He was not saying that the suffering of the camps was valuable. He was saying something much more specific, that within any situation, no matter how constrained, no matter how stripped of comfort and choice and dignity, the human being retains one final freedom. The freedom to choose their attitude toward what they cannot change. This freedom is tiny in the sense that it produces no change in the external situation. The suffering does not go away because one chooses an attitude toward it. The cold is still cold, the loss is still lost. The diagnosis does not improve because of what one decides about it in the middle of the night, but it is enormous in the sense that it is, in the end, the only freedom that cannot be taken. The guards at Auschwitz could take Frankl's clothes, his food, his wife, his manuscript, his freedom of movement, his physical safety, his future. They could not reach the part of him that decided each day how to stand in relation to all of this. He wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." That sentence is often attributed to him now, though the precise attribution is uncertain and scholars have disputed the source. What is certain is that it captures something he believed and lived. The third path, available even when the first two are closed. Let the body rest. This is the deepest thing Frankl found. We will come back to it. Chapter 22. Martin Buber and the presence between. Buber spent years living and studying among the Hasidic communities of Eastern Europe before the war, and he brought from that experience a quality of attention that was, as he put it, dialogical. The Hasidic teachers he encountered were not interested in abstract theology. They were interested in the encounter, the actual moment of meeting between the teacher and the student, between the person and their God, between any two beings who were genuinely present to each other. He formalized this into I and Thou, published in 1923. The book is difficult in the way that important books often are, not because the ideas are obscure, but because the ideas keep running into the inadequacy of the vocabulary available to express them. Buber keeps reaching for a language of relation that ordinary language, organized around subjects and objects, does not quite have. His central claim is that the genuine encounter, the I-thou moment, is not something one does to another person. It is something that happens between. It is, in his phrase, in the between. Not in me, not in you, but in the charged space that exists when two genuinely present persons actually meet. Frankl absorbed this and brought it into the clinic. He believed that the therapeutic encounter was, when it worked properly, an I-thou encounter. The therapist who was fully present to the patient's search, not managing the encounter, not performing attentiveness, but actually receiving the person in front of them as irreplaceable, was providing, in that very act, a form of meaning. The patient was being encountered. And to be genuinely encountered, Buber and Frankl both believed, is one of the deepest human needs there is. The room is still. Let the breath move. Martin Buber was born in Vienna in 1878. He died in Jerusalem in 1965. Between those cities and those years, he developed a philosophy of relationship that Frankl absorbed and used in ways Buber himself might not have anticipated. Buber's central idea is simple to state and difficult to enact. He proposed a distinction between two modes of encountering the world. The first he called I-it. In this mode, the self encounters everything else, including other people, as objects, as things to be used, categorized, gotten through, the traffic on the commute, the colleague in the meeting, the person behind the counter, the partner at the end of a long day. The second mode he called I-thou. In this mode, the self encounters the other as a genuine other, as a subject rather than an object, as a presence with their own irreducible interior life. Not a background element, not a function, a person, a face, a this. The I-thou encounter, Buber argued, is the site of genuine meaning. Not in the sense that it is more pleasant, though it often is, in the sense that it is where the self actually shows up. The self in I-it mode is managed, functional, defended. The self in I-thou mode is present, and presence, he believed, is what the human being is actually reaching for in all the ways it reaches. Frankl took this into the clinic. He saw in Buber's distinction a clinical category. The person who cannot find meaning often cannot find it because they have settled into an almost exclusive I-it mode. The world has become something to be managed rather than met. Other people have become surfaces rather than depths. And the self, somewhere in there, has begun to feel unreal. The antidote is not a technique, it is attention. The willingness to slow down enough to actually receive the person in front of you as a presence and not a function. He thought about Tilly that way. In the camps, in the cold, he thought of her not as a concept of his wife, but as her particular, specific, irreplaceable presence. That mode of attention was, he later wrote, sustaining in a way that no other thought about her had been. I, thou. Not a technique, a way of being with. Let the room be still. Let the breath move. We go on. Chapter 23. Dostoevsky before the rifles. Dostoevsky spent 4 years in Siberia after the commuted sentence. The conditions were brutal. He was separated from his books, his writing, his world. He was placed among criminals rather than the political prisoners he had expected to be grouped with, and the experience of that proximity, the daily contact with men who had committed serious crimes against other people, gave him a quality of psychological insight into human darkness that his earlier work had lacked. He returned from Siberia having written nothing. He was forbidden to write for most of his time there, but having observed everything. The novels that followed, Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, The Brothers Karamazov, bear the weight of what he had seen. They are full of people at the edge of themselves, people whose darkness is not a simplification but a complexity, people who are capable of the worst and the best, and sometimes both at once. Frankl taught Dostoevsky to his students as a psychologist, not merely as a novelist. He believed the great Russian novels were, among other things, the most detailed phenomenological studies of the existential condition available in literature. They showed what happens to people when the usual structures of meaning collapse, when the God of their childhood is revealed as inadequate, when the social contract is exposed as contingent, when the scaffolding of a life comes down and the person is left with what they actually are. What Dostoevsky found in those moments, and found again in Siberia, and kept returning to in his novels, was this: under the worst conditions, something in the human being persists. The something is not always beautiful, but it is always there. Feel the body where it rests. We continue. In December 1849, Fyodor Dostoevsky was led into the yard at Semyonovsky Square in St. Petersburg to be executed. He was 28 years old. He had been convicted of revolutionary activity, essentially of being in the wrong reading group at the wrong historical moment. The sentence was death by firing squad. He was prepared at the stake. A priest read the last rites. The prisoners were dressed in white execution shirts. The first volley of rifles was raised. Then a rider arrived with a message. The Tsar was commuting the sentence. They would not be shot, they would be sent to Siberia instead. The rifles were lowered. In the seconds between the raised rifles and the lowered rifles, Dostoevsky later said he understood something about existence that he had not understood before. He understood its value without argument. He did not need a philosophical proof. He did not need a logical demonstration. The value was self-evident in the experience of its potential loss. He went to Siberia. He served 4 years of hard labor. He returned to St. Petersburg and wrote, among other things, The Idiot, Crime and Punishment, and The Brothers Karamazov, works that would be read by every generation that came after him, translated into every language, named among the central achievements of human literature. Frankl read all of it. He taught it. He saw in Dostoevsky's life a confirmation of what he had been arguing since the 1930s, that suffering genuinely confronted rather than merely survived tends to produce the conditions for a particular kind of depth. Not always, not automatically, not in everyone. The suffering also destroys. Dostoevsky knew that. Frankl knew that. But in the cases where it produced depth, the mechanism was recognizable. The person had been forced into a genuine confrontation with finitude and had come back from that confrontation with something they had not had before, a revised sense of proportion, a knowledge of what actually mattered now that the comfortable illusion of infinite time had been removed. Dostoevsky before the rifles, Frankl at the arriving cattle car, Marcus Aurelius in the tent, Seneca waiting for the messenger from Nero, Pascal in his cold room. The same confrontation recurring across centuries and conditions, and always the same question. Now that you know, what will you do with what remains? Feel the weight of the body, let the breath come and go. We continue. Chapter 24. What suffering is and is not for. The distinction Frankl was making has a philosophical ancestor in the work of the philosopher Gabriel Marcel, who wrote about what he called primary and secondary reflection. Primary reflection is the mind's first response to a situation: analysis, categorization, problem-solving. It treats the situation as an object to be handled. Secondary reflection is what happens when primary reflection reaches its limits, when the situation cannot be handled, only inhabited. It is the shift from treating the situation as something outside the self to recognizing that the self is inside the situation. Suffering, in the deepest sense, forces secondary reflection. It cannot always be solved. It cannot always be treated. Sometimes it can only be inhabited. And the quality of that inhabitation, what the person brings to it, what they find inside it, is where the third path lives. Frankl was not prescribing suffering. He was describing what suffering, when it arrives, despite every effort to prevent or mitigate it, reveals. It reveals the person who was behind all the management. The person who exists when the solutions run out, that person, he found, was more resilient than the solutions were. The solutions, the treatments, the distractions, the plans, the achievements were all good. He was not against any of them, but they were proximate. They were the means by which the person reached toward meaning. The person doing the reaching was what remained when the means were taken. Nothing you are carrying tonight requires this extremity. But the principle is the same. Let the breath come and go, we go on. Here is something Viktor Frankl was very careful about, and it is worth being careful about it here too. He did not believe that suffering was good. He did not believe that the camps were redemptive in themselves. He did not believe that people who had not suffered profoundly were lesser, or that suffering was a prerequisite for depth of character. What he believed was more precise and more useful than any of that. He believed that suffering, when it is unavoidable, when it cannot be removed by action, when it cannot be escaped or treated or changed, becomes a question rather than merely an event. The question is, what will this do to me? Or more precisely, what will I do with this? He had seen both answers. He had watched people in the camps who were broken by the suffering, whose inner life collapsed under it, who lost the thread, who committed acts they would not have committed otherwise, who stopped caring about anything, who died without having made use of what remained. He had watched this without judgment. It was an understandable response to conditions that were designed to produce it. He had also watched, less often but reliably, people who did not break. Not in the sense of not suffering, they suffered as much as anyone, but in the sense of retaining, through the suffering, something the suffering had not quite reached, an inner posture, a refusal to become only their circumstances. He was not saying these people were stronger or better. He was saying they had found a way to locate, even in extremity, the one freedom that could not be taken, the freedom to decide what meaning to make of what was happening to them. The philosopher William James, an American psychologist, writing at the turn of the 20th century, long before Frankl, had made a related observation. The greatest revolution of our generation, James wrote, is the discovery that human beings, by changing the inner attitudes of their minds, can change the outer aspects of their lives. James was writing about everyday life, not about concentration camps. But Frankl found confirmation for James's claim in the most extreme conditions imaginable, not by manufacturing positive thinking, not by denying the reality of what was happening, but by choosing, in the space between what was inflicted and how one stood in relation to it, something that was genuinely chosen. This is not easy. It is not even always possible, but it is available, Frankl argued, more often and in more extreme conditions than most people have discovered. Let the breath move. Let the room be still. We continue. Chapter 25, The Mind That Replays. The philosopher William James made an observation about habit that Frankl would have found useful. Habits are the flywheel of society, and the person who has established good habits has freed their higher faculties for the things that require genuine attention. The implication for rumination is this: the loop that keeps returning to the same conversation, the same failure, the same unresolved question, is often the mind trying to convert a live problem into a settled habit. It wants to file the thing, to arrive at a response that becomes automatic and stops requiring energy. The looping is not irrational. It is the mind doing its job of pattern formation. The problem is that some things cannot be filed in this way. Some things require not a settled response, but a genuine engagement. The ruminating mind is often trying to solve a problem that is not solvable in the mode of problem solving. The conversation that went wrong cannot be undone. The relationship that deteriorated cannot be restored by replaying the deterioration. The choice that was made cannot be unmade by reviewing it repeatedly. What the loop is actually asking for underneath the surface of the specific content is usually a different kind of engagement, not "how do I resolve this?" but "what does this tell me about what I actually care about?" And given what I actually care about, what is the next step that is genuinely mine to take? Frankl called this the shift from symptom to signal. The loop is a symptom. The signal is the care it is reporting. The room is still. Come back gently. We are still here. You know this experience. A conversation that ended 3 days ago or 3 years ago has returned again. You are lying in the quiet, the house is still, and the conversation is running again. You are editing your lines. You are giving yourself better responses than you had in the moment. You are arguing the case you failed to argue at the time, to an audience that no longer exists in a setting that has long since dissolved. The psychologist Ethan Kross, in his book Chatter, names this process by its ordinary name, rumination. He distinguishes it from thinking in a useful way. Thinking is directed. It moves toward something. It processes information in order to produce a decision or a resolution or an understanding. Rumination circles. It returns to the same ground and does not move. Kross observes that rumination is not simply a mood problem, it has a grammar. It tends to use the first-person singular, I, in a way that locks the thinker inside the experience rather than creating distance from it. He found in his research that one of the simplest and most effective interventions for habitual ruminators is a change of pronoun. Addressing yourself by your own name. What is Victor doing? Why is Victor going back to this? Creates a small but measurable cognitive distance that tends to allow the thinker to see the loop from the outside rather than being trapped inside it. Frankl had a related observation, arrived at by different means. He noticed that patients who were most captured by rumination tended to be patients who had not yet located what he called the will to meaning. They were not circling because they were choosing to, they were circling because the underlying disorientation, the absence of a direction that felt genuinely theirs, left the mind with nowhere to go. The loop was not the problem. The loop was the symptom. The problem was deeper. His approach to rumination was not to try to stop the thoughts. It was to ask what the thoughts were circling around. What is the unresolved question that this loop is trying unsuccessfully to process? And can that question be named more clearly? Because a question that is named can sometimes be approached. A question that is only felt, never articulated, can only be circled. If your mind has been drifting, that is fine. Come back gently. We are still here. The loop is not permanent, and it always has a center. We are looking slowly and without hurry for the center. Chapter 26, Tolstoy's Ivan Ilyich. There is a servant in the story named Gerasim, a peasant, young and strong, who is assigned to care for Ivan Ilyich in the final period of his illness. Gerasim is the only person in the novel who is genuinely present to Ivan Ilyich's dying. He does not pretend the dying is not happening. He does not perform appropriate sadness. He is simply there, practically and uncomplainingly, holding Ivan's legs in the position that gives him relief, sitting with him through the nights, carrying out the necessary functions of care with a directness that Ivan all his life had looked for in his human relationships and never quite found. Tolstoy's point, through Gerasim, is about the authenticity of the uncultivated life. Not the stupid life, not the brutish life, but the life that has not been taught to perform. Gerasim helps because helping is what the situation requires, and he has not learned to consult the audience before responding to what the situation requires. Ivan Ilyich had learned. He had learned so well that he could no longer find the authentic response beneath the performed one. And the agony of his dying, which Tolstoy renders with a precision that is almost clinical, is not physical agony. It is the agony of a man discovering, in the last days of his life, that the life he has lived was not quite his. And then, at the end, something shifts. He stops arguing with the reality of what is happening. He forgives himself, or something like that. And in the stopping and the forgiving, the agony changes its quality. Something opens that had been closed. Frankl read this as confirmation of the third path. The shift is not toward happiness, it is toward meaning. In 1886, Leo Tolstoy published a novella called The Death of Ivan Ilyich. It is not a pleasant story. It is one of the most useful things ever written about what happens when a person approaches the end of their life and discovers with horror that they may have been living someone else's life all along. Ivan Ilyich Golovin is a successful judge in 19th century Russia. He has done everything correctly. He married appropriately, advanced steadily, furnished his house in the fashionable style, managed his social obligations with the right mixture of formality and levity. He has not been cruel. He has not been dishonest. He has followed the form. He develops an illness. As he deteriorates, he begins to feel a terror that is not simply about dying. It is about the quality of the life he is being asked to leave. He looks back across his years and he cannot with confidence identify a single moment that was genuinely his own. Everything was performed. Everything was for the audience of his social world. The moments of genuine connection with his young son, with the peasant who nursed him, with a few brief early memories, were exceptions so rare that they had barely registered at the time. Tolstoy wrote this story after his own experience of what is sometimes called an existential crisis, a period in his late 40s when he, one of the most celebrated writers in Europe, had concluded that his life was meaningless and that he could not understand why he should not simply end it. He wrote about this crisis in his confession. He came through it, and then he wrote Ivan Ilyich, which is the story of the man who did not come through it in time. Frankl assigned it to his students. He saw in it the clearest possible narrative depiction of what the existential vacuum left unexamined produces. At the end of a life, not necessarily a wicked life, not a failed life by any external measure, a life lived without contact with what the person actually valued, because the person had never been still enough to ask what that was. The remedy Tolstoy offers in the story is almost comically simple. Toward the end, Ivan Ilyich stops resisting. He stops performing. He stops arguing with what is happening to him. And in that stopping, something small but decisive opens. The simplicity of the ending is not a trick. It is the point. Let the body rest. Let the jaw soften. We go on. But, chapter 27. The Sunday without plans. Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, wrote about what he called the two selves. The social self, the self that is constructed and maintained for others, that moves through the world with its managed surface intact, and the deep self. The deep self is the one that sometimes emerges in music, or in solitude, or in the experience of beauty so sudden that the social self does not have time to intercede and perform a response before the genuine one has already arrived. The Sunday without plans is an inadvertent access point to the deep self. When the social self has nothing to perform, when there is no audience and no agenda and no obligation shaping the shape of the hours, the deep self sometimes surfaces. And what it surfaces with is not always comfortable. It is often the unresolved question. It is the feeling of the second kind of emptiness. It is the thing that was being managed by the Monday through Saturday schedule. Frankl believed the discomfort of the unscheduled Sunday was productive rather than pathological. The person who can sit with that discomfort long enough to hear what it is saying is closer to the genuine work than the person who fills the space before the feeling arrives. The genuine work, in his formulation, is always the work of locating the specific thing. Not what is the meaning of life, but what is mine to do with this Sunday, this week, this life, specifically and without pretense. The question is almost never grand. The answer is almost never grand. But both are genuine, and that is the point. Let the room be still. We continue. Imagine a Sunday with nothing in it. Not a Sunday you have been given by illness or circumstance, though it might feel that way at first. A Sunday with no obligations, no errands, no people expecting your arrival somewhere. The alarm does not go off. The phone can be ignored. The day is unscheduled in a way that would have sounded like freedom when you were in the middle of a busier week. And yet, the first hour is fine. The second hour is a little uncomfortable. By the third hour, something is stirring. Not sadness exactly, not boredom exactly. Something more like the second kind of emptiness, the one Frankl named, the one that arrives not when something is wrong, but when the structure that was covering the question of what you actually want has been removed, and the question is standing there patient and unanswered. This is the Sunday neurosis. Frankl named it in the 1940s, and it is, if anything, more common now. The culture has become better at filling time and worse at inhabiting it. The devices in the pockets of people who cannot sit still are the most sophisticated distraction mechanisms ever produced. And they are used by people who, when the distraction is removed, find they are not certain what they are trying to avoid feeling. What are you trying to avoid feeling? Frankl did not think this was a pathological question. He thought it was the necessary one. The Sunday without plans is not a problem to be solved with better scheduling. It is a diagnostic moment. It is the moment when the underlying orientation of a life becomes briefly visible because the covering is off. What he suggested, not in those terms, but in the clinical evidence he accumulated over decades, was that the people who managed the unscheduled Sunday with equanimity rather than dread were not the people with more entertaining inner resources. They were the people who had, through reflection or through accident or through genuine life experience, located something specific that was theirs, a practice, a relationship, a question they were genuinely curious about. Something that did not require an appointment and did not need external validation. The Sunday without plans is, in this sense, the field test for the existential life. Breathe. Let the body soften. The room is still. We continue into the longer part of the night. Chapter 28. Csikszentmihalyi and the absorbed life. He distinguished between two types of experience that are often conflated. Pleasure, which he defined as the satisfaction of biological need or social expectation, the meal after hunger, the approval after effort, the comfort after discomfort. And enjoyment, which he defined as the experience of forward movement, the sense of having done something, discovered something, mastered something, reached towards something that was previously beyond reach. Pleasure requires only that the condition be satisfied. Enjoyment requires that something be at stake and that the person meet it. It is more effortful and rarer and, in his data, far more sustaining. Flow is the peak form of enjoyment. It is the state in which the challenge and the skill are so precisely matched that the effort itself becomes effortless in a paradoxical way. The person is working at the edge of their capacity, and yet the experience is one of ease. The musician in the passage, the athlete in the run, the surgeon in the complex procedure, the parent in the full attention conversation with the child. He found, across cultures and ages and occupations, that the people who reported the highest levels of well-being were not the people with the most leisure or the fewest obligations. They were the people who had found conditions of regular flow, who had, through design or luck or both, arranged their lives so that the thing they were good at and the thing that was required of them were in productive alignment. This is the first path in its most optimal form. Not just creating. Creating in alignment with capacity. Working at the edge that makes it real. Let the breath come and go. We continue. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, pronounced approximately Csikszentmihalyi, was a Hungarian-American psychologist who spent his career studying a specific and unusual psychological state that he named flow. He was born in 1934 inches what is now Croatia. He survived the Second World War as a child. He was struck watching the adults around him in the aftermath by the way some people manage the chaos better than others, not through superior intelligence or superior resources, but through a particular quality of engagement with whatever they were doing. The people who seemed most whole were the people who were most absorbed. Flow, as Csikszentmihalyi defined it from decades of research, is the state of optimal experience that occurs when the difficulty of a task is matched by the skill required to perform it. When the challenge is slightly beyond the current level of skill, the person stretches. When the challenge is slightly below it, the person stagnates. When the match is right, something happens that is different from either. The person disappears into the task. The sense of time distorts. An hour can feel like 10 minutes, or like many hours. Self-consciousness recedes. The internal critic goes quiet. The person is simply doing the thing, and the doing of the thing is its own justification. He found this state in chess grandmasters, in surgeons, in rock climbers, in musicians deep in performance, in mathematicians working a proof, in assembly line workers who had found the rhythm of the line. The state itself was not restricted to prestigious or creative work. It was available wherever the conditions were right. Here is what connects Csikszentmihalyi's work to Frankl's. Flow is, among other things, a way of being present in the first path, the path of creation. The absorbed carpenter, the absorbed teacher, the absorbed parent, the absorbed writer are all in flow, not only doing the thing, but finding a quality of experience in it that is independent of the outcome. They are not waiting for the meaning to arrive at the end. The meaning is in the absorption. Frankl believed the will to meaning was the primary human drive. Csikszentmihalyi found its expression in the laboratory of optimal experience. They were describing the same phenomenon from different angles. The absorbed life is not the goal. It is the consequence of the right relationship between what a person does and what a person is. Let the breath move. We are in the third hour now. You do not need to follow every word. Chapter 29, What Frankl Survived to Say. He gave his first public lecture about the camps in 1946, less than a year after liberation. He was still underweight. He was still processing the losses. He stood at the podium and spoke with the precision that had always characterized his work, and the audience, which included many people who had their own losses from the same period, sat in a quiet that was different from ordinary academic quiet. He was not telling them what had happened to him. He was telling them what he had learned from what had happened to him. And what he had learned was not consoling in any easy sense. It was demanding. It was, you are responsible for finding the direction. The meaning will not be given to you. The life will not organize itself. You have to do the work of the search, and the search is never complete. And that is not a failure. That is the condition. He continued teaching and practicing and writing for 5 more decades. He updated his ideas as evidence accumulated. He changed his mind about details and held his ground on the essentials. He was, to the end, a person who was still learning from the question he had first asked in that Vienna clinic in 1930. What is it that people actually live for? He lived long enough to hear many answers. None of them satisfied him completely. The question, he had concluded, was not supposed to be satisfied. The question was supposed to be kept alive. The person who is still asking, genuinely asking, not performing the asking, is the person who has not stopped moving toward the thing they are looking for. He kept moving. He kept asking. Feel the weight of the body. Let the breath settle. Viktor Frankl was liberated from Turkheim, a subcamp of Dachau, by American troops on the 27th of April, 1945. He was 40 years old. He had spent approximately 3 years in 4 concentration camps. His wife Tilly had died at Bergen-Belsen. His mother had been killed at Auschwitz. His brother, Walter, had died in the camps. His father had died at Theresienstadt. He weighed 90 pounds. In the weeks after liberation, he wandered. There is an account of him walking through a field of flowers and feeling nothing. He wrote about this carefully, not as a shameful episode, but as a clinical observation about the period of disorientation that follows extreme suffering. The nervous system that has been in survival mode for years does not simply return to ordinary sensitivity when the danger ends. It takes time, sometimes a long time. He eventually returned to Vienna. He began working again almost immediately, as a clinician, as a teacher, as a writer. In the first 9 days back at work, he dictated the book that had been in his head since Auschwitz. The book that had replaced the manuscript that was lost in the camps. It was published in German in 1946. It was translated into English in 1959. By the 1960s, it was being taught in universities across America. By the time Frankl died in 1997, it had been translated into 49 languages and sold more than 10 million copies. Man's Search for Meaning. The title he chose is itself an argument. Not man's search for happiness. Not man's path to fulfillment. Man's search for meaning. As if the search itself were the thing, rather than the finding. As if the appropriate orientation toward the question were a sustained and active one, rather than a state to be arrived at and rested in. He lived to be 92. He continued seeing patients. He continued teaching. He learned to fly a plane at 67 years old. He wrote 39 books. He lived toward, that is the only way to say it, he lived toward something from the day of liberation until the end, with a specificity that was visible to everyone who encountered him. This is the manuscript he thought would burn. It did not burn. Feel the weight of the body. Let the breath settle. We are more than halfway through the night now. Chapter 30. The Mask You Set Down. The psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott observed that the therapeutic relationship is one of the rare spaces where the social self is given permission to rest. Not by dramatic instruction, the therapist does not say, "Please stop performing." The permission is implicit in the quality of attention the therapist offers. When the person in front of you is genuinely receiving you as you are, rather than as you are supposed to be, something releases. Frankl noticed this in his own practice. He found that the patients who loosened most quickly, who found the thread most readily, were not always the ones with the strongest insight into their own psychology. They were often simply the ones who felt most genuinely received in the room. The ones who had the experience, perhaps for the first time in a long time, of being present with another person without managing how that presence appeared. He also found that this quality of encounter was available outside the therapy room. It was available in the relationship between close friends who had stopped performing for each other, in the marriage that had passed through enough difficulty to give up on the pretense of its earlier presentation, in the conversation with the older person who had nothing left to prove and simply said what they actually thought. The mask is not the enemy. The mask is useful. The mask is what allows the complicated business of living in the world with other people to proceed. The problem is only when the mask has been worn so long that the person no longer knows where the mask ends and the face begins. Tonight, with no audience present, the mask can rest. Let the room be still. There is a distinction Donald Winnicott drew in his work on child development that Frankl would have recognized from a different direction. Winnicott was a British pediatrician and psychoanalyst who worked in the mid-20th century. He became interested in the very early conditions of psychological development, the first months and years before memory begins, when the self is still forming in the space between the infant and the primary carer. He proposed that two kinds of self develop in this space. He called them the true self and the false self. The true self is spontaneous. It expresses without calculation. It is the impulse before it has been sorted for acceptability, the genuine feeling before it has been managed into the appropriate shape for the social situation. In an infant, it is simple to see. The cry, the reach, the expression of pleasure or distress, without any editing. The false self develops as a response to the environment's requirements. The infant who discovers that certain impulses are not welcomed, that certain expressions of the true self cause distress or withdrawal in the carer, learns to edit. The self that goes out into the world is a curated version. It is not insincere, exactly. It is managed. Winnicott was not condemning the false self. He understood it as necessary. A person who expressed every impulse without editing would be unable to live in society. The false self is a tool. The problem occurs when the tool becomes the person, when the managed version of the self is so consistently deployed, so exclusively inhabited, that the person can no longer locate what lies beneath it. The particular suffering of the person who has lost contact with their true self is not always dramatic. It often presents as the existential vacuum. The second kind of emptiness, the feeling of going through motions that used to feel like genuine living, and now feel like performance. Frankl's three paths all depend, to some degree, on access to the true self. The creation that flows from the false self is formal and hollow. The experience that passes through the false self is processed and categorized before it can land. The attitudinal freedom of the third path requires the person who actually chooses, not the managed version who selects from options the social self has pre-approved. Nothing here asks you to dismantle the mask overnight, only to notice that it is not the face. Let the room be still. Let the breath move. We go on. Chapter 31. Adler and the story we tell to cope. The narrative that Adler identified, the life goal, the organizing strategy built around the early wound, tends to be invisible to the person living it, in the same way that the water is invisible to the fish. It is the medium through which life is experienced, not an object within the experience. The moment the narrative becomes visible is usually a moment of crisis. The strategy that has been working suddenly stops working. The person who has spent decades accumulating power discovers that the power does not produce the safety it was supposed to produce. The person who has spent decades seeking approval discovers that the approval, when it arrives, does not quiet the thing it was supposed to quiet. Frankl's clinical observation in these situations was consistent. The person whose organizing strategy has failed is not, as they often feel, lost. They are available. The failure of the false strategy has created a space where the genuine direction might, for the first time, be heard. He saw this as a clinical opportunity, not to impose a replacement strategy, to help the person, in the space the failure had created, begin the search for the thing that was genuinely theirs rather than the thing they had adopted to manage the early wound. The genuine thing is usually quieter than the strategy, less dramatic, less impressive. By the standards the strategy was trying to impress. But it has a quality the strategy never had. It is actually wanted, not performed toward, wanted. Let the breath move. We go on. Alfred Adler was born in Vienna in 1870. He was a colleague and early associate of Sigmund Freud, eventually expelled from Freud's inner circle for disagreeing about the primacy of sexual drive, and went on to found a school of psychology he called individual psychology. His central contribution, the one that has lasted most durably, is the concept of the life goal. Adler observed that the human being, especially the human being who has experienced some early wound to their sense of competence or belonging, tends to organize their entire life around a strategy designed to compensate for that wound. The person who felt helpless as a child may spend their adulthood relentlessly accumulating power. The person who felt overlooked may spend their adulthood in an unending audition for approval. The person who felt unsafe may build the most impregnable life possible, materially, emotionally, professionally, and live inside it, protected and isolated. The strategy is not conscious, or not entirely conscious. It is more like a story that the person has been telling themselves since very early on, a story about what they need in order to be safe in the world, and they have organized their choices around it for so long that they have forgotten it is a story. Frankl learned from Adler and departed from him. He thought Adler was right, that people organize their lives around unconscious strategies. But he did not think those strategies were primarily about compensation for past wounds, as Adler believed. He thought they were primarily about the search for meaning, which sometimes expressed itself as compensation, but was not reducible to it. The clinical implication is important. If the Adlerian is right, the work of therapy is to uncover the wound and revise the compensation. If Frankl is right, the work of therapy is to help the person find a direction that is genuinely theirs, rather than a strategy inherited from their most frightened moment. Both men were onto something. The two approaches are not incompatible. The wound shapes the search, and the search is what matters. Let the breath move. The room is quiet. We are moving through the long middle of the night now. Chapter 32, Montaigne in his tower. The 64 maxims on the walls of the library were not chosen randomly. They were a curatorial act, a statement about what Montaigne thought he needed to think about. The inscriptions included lines from Ecclesiastes, from the Stoics, from the Greek tragedians. They formed a kind of intellectual environment, a set of questions that would always be visible, that would frame the thinking being done in the room. He wrote about death more than any other topic. Not because he was morbid, his temperament was anything but because he understood, from the Stoic tradition he had absorbed deeply, that the awareness of death is the precondition for the clear sight that the examined life requires. You cannot take stock of a life honestly while pretending it is not finite. He wrote, "To philosophize is to learn how to die." He was quoting Cicero, but the application was his own. The philosophy he was practicing in the tower was not academic, it was preparation. Preparation not for a specific death, but for a life that was aware of its finitude and therefore more honest about what it actually wanted. Frankl had a version of this. He taught his patients that the awareness of death was not something to be defended against, but something to be integrated. The person who has integrated it lives differently, not with greater fear, but with greater clarity. They have done the sorting that the pretense of infinite time allows most people to defer indefinitely. The tower, the maxims on the walls, the attempt to see clearly before the light fails. That is what tonight is, in a small way. The same attempt. In 1571, Michel de Montaigne was 38 years old. He had recently lost his closest friend, Etienne de la Boétie, to plague. He had also lost his father and his first child. He had served in the court of the French king and found the experience alienating in a way he could not quite name. He retired to a round tower on his family's estate in the Bordeaux region of France, had the walls of the library inscribed with 64 maxims from the Latin and Greek philosophers, and began writing. What he wrote was not philosophy in the classical sense. It was not a system. It was not a treatise. It was something stranger and more personal. Essays, from the French word essaye, meaning attempt. Attempts to understand what he thought and felt and observed. Attempts to understand himself by writing about himself, about his fear of death, his digestion, his relations with his friends and his wife, his experience of kidney stones, his opinions about cannibalism, his thoughts on experience and education and sleep. He invented the essay form. He created the conditions for an enormous tradition of reflective writing, from Montaigne to Samuel Johnson to Virginia Woolf to James Baldwin, that begins with the assumption that the careful examination of one's own particular, specific, embodied experience might produce something worth knowing, not in spite of its particularity, but because of it. Frankl had read Montaigne. He had absorbed, without perhaps explicitly acknowledging, Montaigne's fundamental argument that the self is worth examining, that the examined self produces a kind of knowledge that no other method produces, and that this knowledge, personal, local, limited, is nonetheless genuinely knowledge. The retirement to the tower was not a retreat from life. It was the most fully lived part of Montaigne's life. In the tower, with his books and his peculiar mind, and his willingness to write down what he actually thought rather than what he was supposed to think, he was doing what Frankl would later describe as the most essential human work, locating the specific, irreplaceable direction that was genuinely his own. The tower, the lamp, the pen, the attempt. Let your jaw soften. Feel the weight of the body where it rests. We go on. Chapter 33, The Body That Carries the Count. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep does not fix. You have probably known it. You sleep 8 hours and wake up already halfway through some calculation you cannot name. You go through the day functional and intact, carrying something that has no specific shape, but that nevertheless has weight. You lie down again, and the weight is still there. Bessel van der Kolk spent decades studying what happens to the body under sustained stress and loss. His work, gathered in a book called The Body Keeps the Score, arrived at a conclusion that Frankl would have recognized immediately. Though van der Kolk reached it through neuroscience rather than philosophy. The body is not a passive container for the mind's experience. It is a participant. What we have lived, the losses, the near misses, the accumulated disappointments, the moments when we could not respond in the way we needed to, these things do not evaporate once the moment has passed. They are held somewhere in the tissue, in the posture, in the quality of the breath. Van der Kolk was writing specifically about trauma, but he was pointing at something broader, the way the body carries an account of what has happened, even when the mind has performed its various acts of management and compartmentalization. The tight shoulders, the shallow breath, the jaw that takes effort to unclench. These are not metaphors, they are records. Frankl had observed this in the camps. He had watched what happened to people when they stopped being able to find meaning in their situation, how the physical collapse tended to follow the inner collapse, sometimes within days. And he had watched the reverse, how the person who located even a provisional reason, a thought, a memory, a task still to be completed, carried themselves differently, not triumphantly, not without suffering, but differently. The body that carries the count is not weak, it is honest, it is reporting faithfully on what the life has contained. What might it need tonight other than more endurance? Let the shoulders drop. Let the jaw soften. Feel the weight of the body where it meets the surface beneath you. This is not asking you to feel anything in particular, only to notice what is already there. Nothing you hear tonight asks anything of you except to be present in this room, in this body, in this quiet hour. We continue. Chapter 34, The Second Kind of Emptiness. We planted something early in the night, and it is time to return to it. Two kinds of emptiness. The first kind, grief, loss, the ache of a specific absence. It has a shape because it follows from something that was there and is no longer. The second kind, the hollowness that arrives without a clear cause, in the middle of a life that functions, sometimes in the middle of apparent success, the existential vacuum. Viktor Frankl spent his clinical career asking, what fills the second kind? Not distraction, not achievement, not the warm fog of substances or the smooth machinery of routine. These cover the vacuum without addressing it. The vacuum is still there when the covering is removed. What fills it? In the clinical evidence Frankl accumulated over 5 decades and then confirmed under the worst conditions available for confirmation, is meaning, specific meaning. Not meaning in general, not the philosophical concept of a meaningful life as an abstraction, but the particular, pointed, irreplaceable reason that this specific person, with this specific history and these specific relationships and this specific set of capacities, has for being here. He was precise about what he was and was not saying. He was not saying the meaning was already there, hidden, waiting to be discovered like a buried object. He was saying it was available, that it could be found, created, received, or chosen as an attitude through any of the 3 paths: creation, experience, attitudinal response to unavoidable suffering. He was also saying something harder. He was saying that the second kind of emptiness is not a pathology in the clinical sense. It is a signal. It is the mind reporting that something important has not been named. The person who hears that report clearly, who sits with the discomfort of the empty Sunday rather than filling it immediately with anything that comes to hand, is not in a worse position than the person who finds the distraction. They are in a better position. They are being honest about what is true. The second kind of emptiness, attended to rather than covered over, becomes the beginning of the genuine search. Frankl believed this. He lived it. He lost everything, returned from the camps weighing 90 pounds, and went back to work asking the question, not because he was immune to despair, but because the question was real and he was equipped to pursue it. What is waiting for you? Let the breath move. Let the room be still. We are near the 3rd hour now. Chapter 35. Thich Nhat Hanh, washing the bowl. Thich Nhat Hanh was born in Vietnam in 1926. He was ordained as a Buddhist monk at 16. He spent his adult life teaching, writing, and practicing a form of engaged Buddhism that tried to bring the insights of contemplative life into contact with the suffering of the ordinary world. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1967 by Martin Luther King Jr. for his work in Vietnam during the war. He was exiled from Vietnam shortly after and lived and taught in France for nearly 4 decades before returning. He wrote many books, but he is perhaps most clearly himself in a story he told about washing a bowl. He described the experience of washing a dish after a meal, not rushing through it in order to get to the next thing, not thinking about what comes after, actually washing the dish, being present to the sensation of the water, the texture of the bowl, the temperature of the soap, being, for the duration of the washing, a person who is washing a bowl. He was not suggesting that washing a bowl is the point of existence. He was pointing at something about the quality of attention that determines whether the activity, any activity, is experienced as meaningful or as mere duration. The person who washes the bowl while thinking about the thing after the bowl is not washing the bowl, they are enduring it. And the life composed of endured moments is not a meaningful life, regardless of what those moments contain. The life composed of inhabited moments, moments where the person is actually present to what they are doing, is available to everyone because it does not depend on the quality or scale of the activity. It depends on the quality of the attention. This is Thich Nhat Hanh's contribution to the question Frankl was asking. The first and second paths, creation and experience, are not available only to the person doing significant work or having significant experiences. They are available to the person washing the bowl if they are actually washing the bowl. Frankl would have said, "The bowl is the task. The task is specific. The task is yours. Be present to it. Let the breath move on its own. Let the room be quiet. We go on." Chapter 36. What the Stoics confirmed. Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca. 3 Stoic philosophers separated by decades and circumstance, united by a set of observations that have been confirmed in one form or another by every serious investigation into human resilience since. The Stoics were not, as they are sometimes caricatured, advocates of emotional suppression. They did not teach people to stop feeling. They taught people to distinguish between what they could control and what they could not, and to invest their emotional energy accordingly. Epictetus made this distinction with the most economy. He had been born into slavery, enslaved to a master who broke his leg as a demonstration of power. He was freed and became one of the most celebrated teachers in the Roman world. "Some things are in our control," he wrote in the Enchiridion, "and others are not. In our control are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not in our control are our body, our property, reputation, office, and, in a word, whatever is not of our own doing." He was not saying the uncontrolled things do not matter. He was saying that the suffering caused by wanting what you cannot control is optional in a way that the suffering caused by what actually happens is not. The former is a tax you pay for confusion about the nature of things. The latter is simply what life costs. Frankl absorbed the Stoics and tested them against the camps. His conclusion: they were right about the distinction, but they had not fully named the thing that makes the distinction survivable. What makes it survivable is not merely philosophy, not merely the intellectual understanding of what is and is not in one's control. What makes it survivable is meaning. The sense that the controlled portion of one's experience, the attitude, the response, the inner posture is pointed at something. Philosophy is the map. Meaning is the destination. The Stoics gave Frankl the map. The camps forced him to find the destination. Let your shoulders drop. Notice your breath. You do not need to change it. We go on. Chapter 37. The conversation that never happened. Most people carry at least one. A conversation that was never had with a parent, or a child, or a friend, or a person who died before the conversation was possible. The thing that was almost said, or said badly, or not said because the moment was not right and then the moment was over. The apology that was forming when the relationship ended. The gratitude that never found its way out of the chest. This is a very particular form of the unfinished. It is not exactly grief, though it carries grief's texture. It is not exactly regret, though it overlaps with regret. It is more like a door that stayed open, a conversation that exists in a suspended state of almost, still waiting for a resolution that is no longer possible in the ordinary sense. Martin Buber's I Thou philosophy suggests something useful here. He argued that the genuine encounter, the real meeting between two persons, rather than the management of a social surface, is not bound by the usual conditions of time and proximity in the way other kinds of transaction are. The person who is genuinely present to another, who actually perceives them as irreplaceable and allows that perception to matter, is doing something that does not simply cease because the other person is no longer physically available. The conversation that never happened can, in some form, be finished. Not by pretending the conditions have not changed. Not by suppressing the loss, but by being present enough to the memory of the person to finally say internally the thing that needed to be said. Not as a technique, not as a therapeutic exercise, simply as an act of honesty with what is true. The letter that is never sent. The words said to the empty chair. The quiet acknowledgement in the middle of a night like this one, of the person who is no longer here. This is not strange. This is how the human mind tries to complete what time has left incomplete. It is a form of love continuing past its object. It is its own kind of meaning. Let the breath move. Let the room be still. Chapter 38. Pascal and the Quiet Room. Blaise Pascal was born in Clermont-Ferrand in 1623. He died in Paris in 1662 at 39, of a disease that had troubled him for most of his adult life. In the years between his birth and his death, he produced work in mathematics, physics, and philosophy that placed him among the 2 or 3 most important intellectual figures of the 17th century. He was also, by his own account, one of the most frightened men alive. His most famous pensée, his most well-known note, from the collection published after his death under the title Pensées, is the observation that all of humanity's problems come from an inability to sit quietly alone in a room. He was writing this in a cold room somewhere in the Port Royal community outside Paris, ill and in pain and unable to sleep, and the observation was not primarily about other people, it was about himself. He was afraid of silence. He was afraid of what he heard in it. In the silence, the questions he had spent his professional life trying to answer with mathematics and physics asserted themselves in their raw form. What is this all for? What comes after? Is there anything? He found his way toward a peace late in his short life that was religious in character, a surrender to the God he could not prove but could not do without. He would not have arrived at Frankl's secular framework, but he arrived at the same starting point, the honest acknowledgement that the silence is unbearable until you have found something real to bring to it. Frankl believed that the person who learns to sit with the silence, not to fill it, not to manage it, but to sit with it long enough to hear what it is asking, is the person most likely to find the direction that is genuinely theirs. Tonight is a kind of sitting. The silence around the words is part of the medicine. Let your jaw soften. Let the breath come and go. Nothing you hear tonight asks you to be brave, only to remain. Chapter 39, Amor Fati. Friedrich Nietzsche proposed a concept he called Amor Fati, love of fate. He was not proposing that everything that happens is good. He was not proposing passive acceptance of whatever comes. He was proposing something stranger and more demanding, the willingness to say yes to one's life as it has actually been, including the parts of it one would never have chosen, and to love the whole of it, not because the painful parts are not painful, but because the painful parts are also part of the specific shape of a specific life, which is the only life one has. He wrote about this as an ideal toward which he was reaching, not a state he inhabited. He knew the difference. The works of the final productive years before his collapse in 1889 are full of a man trying very hard to believe what he was teaching, and sometimes succeeding, and sometimes clearly failing. Frankl took Amor Fati and tested it against conditions Nietzsche never imagined. His conclusion was nuanced. He did not believe one had to love the suffering. He did not believe the camp was something to be loved. But he did believe that the person who could arrive, even tentatively, at a willingness to say yes to their life as it had actually been, including Auschwitz, including the losses, including the cold rooms and the difficult years and the empty wins, was the person who had found the deepest form of the third path, the attitudinal freedom, the choice of how to stand in relation to what has been. It is not the acceptance of injustice. It is the acceptance of the reality that the life one has is the life one has, and that continuing to argue with that fact consumes energy that could otherwise be spent on the only question that matters: what now? Amor Fati is not sentimental. It is one of the harder ideas ever proposed, but it is available. Let the room be quiet. We are near the end of the long hold. Chapter 40. The question and its answer. Early in the night, we mentioned a question Viktor Frankl asked at the beginning of almost every therapeutic relationship. What is waiting for you? Not what is wrong, not what do you want, not what are your symptoms. The question that oriented the whole encounter toward what lay ahead rather than what had accumulated behind. Most patients, when they heard the question for the first time, went quiet, not because they could not answer it, because the answer, when it came, surprised them with its specificity and its smallness. It was rarely the grand thing, the achievement, the legacy, the narrative arc. It was almost always something particular and close, something so close it had become invisible through familiarity. The daughter who needed her father present, not in the formal sense, but in the full sense, who needed him to actually see her, not the version of her he was comfortable with. The book that had been 3/4 written for 6 years. The friendship that had been allowed to attenuate through pure negligence. The garden that had been planned and never planted. The walk that was always going to happen when the weather improved or the week got less busy. The answer to what is waiting for you is the first path made specific. It is the meaning that creation takes when it is given a name and a direction. The person who can answer it, however provisionally, however imperfectly, is the person who has found, if not the whole shape of their life, at least the next step in it. Frankl did not require the answer to be permanent. He did not require it to be grand. He required only that it be genuine, that it come from somewhere real rather than from the part of the self that knows what the right answer is supposed to sound like. What is waiting for you? Not the grand version of the answer, the small, true version. You do not need to say it out loud. You do not need to say it at all tonight. But notice if something moves, somewhere, when the question arrives. Let the breath move. Let the body rest. We are near the end. Chapter 41. The 2 a.m. Accountant. At some hour in the night, the mind begins its audit. You know this. The items appear without invitation. The thing you said in the meeting that came out wrong. The call you have been meaning to return for 3 weeks. The money that went to the wrong thing. The time that got away. The relationship that deserved more attention than it received. The apology that is still pending. The plan you had for yourself 10 years ago and have not gotten back to. The mind reviews these items not because it has decided to, it reviews them because the silence has given it the opportunity, and something in the underlying architecture of the self is trying to do the accounting, trying to get the ledger to balance. Viktor Frankl had a name for what the 2 a.m. accountant is actually doing, underneath the surface of the specific items it is reviewing. It is looking for the thread. It is trying to understand whether the things it is cataloguing add up to a direction or only to accumulation. Whether the expenditure of the life has been towards something or simply into the days as they arrived. The accounting is not wrong. The material is not wrong. The specific items, the neglected call, the poorly said thing, the diverted attention, these are real. But the interpretation is often off. The mind treats them as evidence of failure rather than as data about what mattered. If the call still feels like an obligation after 3 weeks, the relationship it belongs to still feels like an obligation. The question is not, why haven't I called? The question is, why do I want to? And the answer to that question is more useful than the guilt. If the apology is still pending, something in you knows it is still owed. The obstacle is not that you have forgotten. The obstacle is something about the conditions of the apology that has not yet been worked through. That is workable. Frankl proposed that the 2 a.m. accountant, given time and a certain willingness to ask the right questions, can be converted from a source of guilt into a compass. The things it returns to are the things that matter. They are reporting, imperfectly and in the vocabulary of regret, what the life has been organized around and what it is still trying to move toward. Let the jaw soften. Let the breath come and go. You do not need to call anyone tonight. The lamp is still on. We continue. Chapter 42, Winnicott and the Self You Set Aside. Donald Winnicott lived from 1896 to 1971. He was a pediatrician before he was a psychoanalyst, and he never entirely shed the pediatrician's habit of watching children before theorizing about them. His ideas came from the clinic rather than the library, and they have a quality of observation that more abstract theorists sometimes lack. His concept of the true self and the false self, which we visited earlier, has a complement that is worth knowing. He believed that the healthy adult life includes the ability to inhabit both. Not the elimination of the false self, the managed, socially appropriate version of the person, but the retention of access to the true self, so that the managed version does not become the only version. The healthy person can slip between them. They can be appropriate in the meeting and then, in the car on the way home, be the person who was not appropriate in the meeting. The unhealthy pattern is not having a false self. Everyone has a false self. The unhealthy pattern is losing the key to the room where the true self lives. Winnicott described the therapeutic goal, in some of its cases, as simply this: helping the person remember where they put the key. Not what the true self says, not what it wants. Just that it exists and that it can be visited. What does the true self want? Not the performed version of the question, where the person thinks of the things they are supposed to want: rest, balance, health, meaningful work, and rehearses them. The actual version, the thing that moves in the direction of wanting before it has been evaluated for acceptability. Frankl would have said, that movement, that pre-reflective pull toward something, that is where the search for meaning begins. Not in the philosophical examination, but in the honest noticing of what the body leans toward when the performance is suspended. Tonight is a kind of suspension. The audience is not here. Let the room be still. Let the breath move. We are nearing the end. Chapter 43. Lao Tzu and the River. The Tao Te Ching is attributed to a figure named Lao Tzu, though scholars have debated for centuries whether Lao Tzu was a single person, a composite, or a name attached to a tradition. The text itself was likely compiled sometime in the 4th or 3rd century before the Common Era. It consists of 81 brief chapters, it is the most translated text in human history after the Bible. Its central image is water. Water is the softest thing, yet it can penetrate mountains and earth. The mountain resists. The water does not resist. The water goes around, under, through, patient over what would have to be geological time for any individual to observe, and it arrives. The Tao is the way things flow when they are not being forced. The path a life takes when the person is not insisting on the path they expected. The direction revealed when the constant effort to impose direction is relaxed. Lao Tzu was not prescribing passivity. He was describing a quality of attentiveness, a listening to the situation rather than a performing upon it. The Taoist ideal is not the person who does nothing. It is the person who does the right thing at the right moment without excess force, by being sufficiently present to the situation to understand what it requires. Viktor Frankl would have recognized this in Taoist terms, even if he did not use them. He had observed in the camps that the people who spent enormous energy resisting the reality of their situation, who kept insisting it could not be what it was, who kept arguing with what had clearly already happened, burned through their resources quickly. The people who could accept the reality of the situation, however terrible, without losing themselves to it, retained something. Not immunity, a kind of traction. The water does not argue with the mountain. The water finds the way through. This is not despair. This is not surrender. This is the intelligence that knows the difference between what can be moved and what cannot, and spends its energy accordingly. Let the breath come and go. Let the room be still. We are near the end of the night. Chapter 44, What Your Life Has Already Been. Here is something Viktor Frankl said that sounds almost counterintuitive until you sit with it. The past is the most secure form of meaning there is. He was not being ironic. He was making a philosophical observation. The future is uncertain. Everything you hope for, everything you plan for, everything you intend to do can be undone by circumstance, illness, loss, the plain unpredictability of what comes next. The future is not secure. The present is a moving point. It keeps becoming the past faster than you can inhabit it. But the past is permanent. What has been, has been. The kind word given on a Tuesday 14 years ago is, in the ontological sense, more secure than anything in the future. It cannot be taken away. It happened. It is in the record, as it were, in the actual record, the one that is not stored anywhere retrievable, but that is nonetheless real. He was making this point in the context of discussing older patients, people who look back over long lives and felt that what remained ahead was too little to matter. He was arguing that this was a fundamental misapprehension. The life they had already lived was not behind them in the sense of being lost. It was behind them in the sense of being permanently, irreversibly preserved. The love given, the work done, the courage shown, the small acts of care, these were safely in the past, which is to say, they were safer than anything that had not yet happened. This is a consolation that takes some time to feel. We have been taught to look forward. The past is what we are escaping or revising, or what has been resolved or needs to be. Frankl was suggesting a different relationship with it, the past as a record of meaning that cannot be undone. What your life has already been, it is enough. Let that sit. The body rests, the breath moves, the room is still. Chapter 45, the last pages of the journal. On a night in 1944 or 1945, in a camp that Viktor Frankl had calculated he was unlikely to leave, he sat with whatever materials were available to him and reconstructed a piece of what had been lost. He did not know if he would survive. He wrote it down anyway, not because he was certain it would matter, because the act of writing it was itself a form of meaning. The first path, creation, directed outward towards something beyond the present moment, beyond the present self. This is what writing is at its best. Not the production of a product, not the management of information, a reaching, a speaking to someone who is not yet there, across a distance that cannot be calculated in advance. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself in the tent. Montaigne wrote to the reader he imagined in his tower. Kierkegaard wrote under pseudonyms, speaking to versions of himself he was trying to understand. Frankl wrote the reconstruction of his manuscript in a barrack at night, to readers in a future he could not be certain would arrive. All of them were doing the same thing. They were refusing, in the most private and the most essential sense, to let the moment be only what it appeared to be. They were insisting, through the act of writing, of thinking, of attention, that the present moment pointed toward something, that it was not only duration, that it was also direction. The last pages of the journal, Frankl's, Marcus's, Montaigne's, anyone's, are not the end of the thing. They are the last step in the reach. The reach itself does not end where the pages run out. It continues into whoever reads the words and is changed by them. It continues into the evening, years after the writer is gone, when someone lying in the dark in a comfortable room hears the voice on a speaker and feels, for a moment, less alone. This is what the first path is for. This is what the second path is for. This is why the third path matters. The light was left on. Someone would come. Let the room be still. Let the breath settle. We are nearly done. Chapter 46. Back to the hour after midnight. We began in a particular kind of quiet. The house had gone still. The sounds of the day had settled, and a question had arrived that had been patient all day, waiting for the noise to clear. What was it actually for? We have been sitting with that question for 4 hours now. Not to answer it, not in the definitive sense, not the way a proof is answered or a form is completed, but to understand it better, to understand the shape of it, the history of it, the company it keeps. Viktor Frankl asked it in Vienna in the 1930s, in the clinic with the students who could not find a reason. He asked it in Auschwitz and Dachau, in the freezing mornings and the long nights and the moments when the only thing that kept him from a collapse he might not have recovered from was the image of his wife's face, and the half-reconstructed manuscript sewn into the top lining of a coat. He asked it in the lecture halls and the consulting rooms of the 40 years after the war, in dialogue with thousands of people who had come to him carrying the same question in different shapes. His answer, accumulated over a life, was not a formula. It was not a prescription. It was something more like a set of practices. Look for what you can give, because creation is meaning. Look for what you can receive, because experience is meaning. And look at how you choose to stand in relation to what you cannot change, because that attitude is also meaning, and it is the one form of freedom that cannot be taken. He added one other thing, which might be the most important. Stop looking for meaning in general. Start looking for the specific thing in your specific life that is waiting for your specific presence. Not the meaning of life, the meaning in this day, this conversation, this task, this person. The room around you is still. The house has gone quiet. What is waiting for you? Let the question sit. Let the breath move. Chapter 47. One thought before sleep. There is no resolution that will arrive in the next few minutes before sleep. That is not the point. The point is smaller and more available than resolution. It is the direction of the attention. Where does the mind point when you have finished the accounting, finished the replaying, finished the review of what was said and what should have been said and what might yet be said? Frankl believed, and this is perhaps his simplest and most applicable idea, that the mind pointed at meaning tends to sleep differently than the mind pointed at nothing. Not better sleep, necessarily, in the clinical sense, not faster sleep, but sleep that comes in a slightly different posture. The body of the person who has, however tentatively, answered the question, "What is waiting for me?" rests differently than the body of the person for whom the question is still unanswered. Something releases. Not everything, not all at once, but something. He did not claim this as a cure. He was too careful for that. He claimed it as an observation, and the observation has held. So before you drift, if there is one thing to bring from tonight into the quiet that follows, not a resolution, not a plan, just a direction, the smallest possible direction, the one genuine thing that is waiting for your presence, however small, however ordinary, however far from what you imagined your meaningful life would look like. It does not have to be grand. It only has to be real. Let the shoulders drop. Let the jaw soften. Let the breath move on its own. The room is still. Chapter 48. The lamp is still on. Viktor Frankl was 92 years old when he died, in September 1997 in Vienna. He had been married a second time to Eleanor, who survives him still and who has continued the work of the Viktor Frankl Institute. He had a daughter, he had grandchildren. He had flown a small plane at 67, he had lectured on 6 continents. He had answered the question, "What is waiting for you?" with the ongoing answer of his life, right up until it was over. He did not say that suffering is good. He did not say that loss is meaningful in itself. He said that the human being is capable, even in conditions that appear designed to eliminate this capacity, of finding something to reach for, and that the reaching is what matters. The reaching is what holds the person together when everything else has been taken. Somewhere, right now, there is a lamp still on in a room where a person is awake in the middle of the night asking the question. It is the question that was asked in the tent on the Danube, and in the barrack in Auschwitz, and in the tower in Bordeaux, and in the round library where 64 maxims were inscribed on the walls. It is always the same question. What is this for? What is waiting? What do I hold on to? The question is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of being awake in the full sense to what it costs to be alive and what it returns. Frankl's answer, arrived at through 70 years of thinking and living and losing and returning, was not complicated. It was this: look for the specific thing, the small, true thing, the thing that is genuinely yours, and live toward it with whatever days remain. One more breath. Let the body rest fully now. The question does not need to be answered tonight. It only needs to be kept. Sleep now.